Introduction. Hello everyone, I'm the narrator, and I'm here to help you today. I know you're using this video to sleep, so before we start, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're from and what time it is as you're watching. Relax and unwind.
I never should have agreed to house sit for my aunt. The isolation, the creaking noises, the shadows that seemed to move on their own. It all felt wrong from the moment I stepped through the door. But it wasn't until the third night that I realized just how much danger I was in. The day had been uneventful, filled with the mundane tasks of caring for my aunt's sprawling country home while she vacationed in Europe. I'd watered her prized orchids, fed her temperamental cat, and spent hours curled up on the porch swing, losing myself in a book as the sun dipped below the tree line. As darkness fell, I locked up and headed to the guest room, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The house settled around me, its old bones creaking and groaning in the cooling night air. I was just drifting off to sleep when a sharp crack jolted me awake. My heart raced as I sat up, straining my ears. There it was again, a distinct snap, like a twig breaking underfoot. It was coming from outside. I slid out of bed, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor as I crept to the window. The full moon cast an eerie glow over the expansive lawn, throwing long shadows across the overgrown grass. At first I saw nothing unusual. Then a flicker of movement caught my eye. A dark figure darted between the trees at the edge of the property. I rubbed my eyes, certain I was seeing things. But when I looked again, I saw not one but two shadows moving with purpose along the tree line. They were too large to be animals, their movements too deliberate. My mouth went dry. I was alone, miles from the nearest neighbor, watching strangers prowl the grounds. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. Should I call the police? But what would I tell them? That I saw shadows moving in the moonlight? They'd laugh it off, tell me to get some sleep. I needed more proof. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone and crept downstairs. Each step on the old staircase felt like a thunderclap in the silence. I made my way to the kitchen, keeping low and away from windows. The back door was there, leading out onto a small patio. If I could just get a better look. I eased the door open, wincing at the slight creak of its hinges. The cool night air raised goosebumps on my skin as I stepped outside. I could see more of the yard from here, the moonlight painting everything in shades of silver and black. Minutes ticked by as I scanned the tree line, my eyes straining in the darkness. Had I imagined it all? Was my mind playing tricks on me? Then I saw them. Two men dressed in dark clothing slipping from behind a large oak tree. They were heading towards the house. I ducked back inside, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. This was real. This was happening. I had to do something. I rushed to the front door, checking that it was locked. Same with all the windows on the ground floor. As I secured the last one, a floorboard creaked behind me. I whirled around, expecting to come face to face with an intruder, but the hallway was empty. It was just the house settling, I told myself. Just the house. Back in the kitchen, I grabbed the largest knife I could find. Its weight in my hand was reassuring, even as my palm grew slick with sweat. I needed to call for help. I reached for my phone only to find the screen black and unresponsive. Dead battery. Of course, the landline. There had to be a landline. I searched frantically, trying to remember where I'd seen a phone. Study? Living room? My panic was making it hard to think straight. Another noise stopped me in my tracks. A scraping sound like metal on metal. It was coming from the front door. They were trying to get in. I pressed myself against the wall, knife clutched to my chest. My options were limited. I could try to run, but where? The dense woods surrounding the property would only give them more places to hide, to ambush me. I could fight, but against two men, the odds weren't in my favor. The scraping stopped, replaced by hushed whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. Frustration. The lock was holding. I had to use this time, had to find a way to contact someone, anyone. Moving as quietly as I could, I made my way to my aunt's study. There, on the antique desk, was an old rotary phone. I'd thought it was just for show, a quaint relic from a bygone era. Now it was my lifeline. I picked up the receiver, nearly sobbing with relief when I heard the dial tone. My fingers shook as I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The calm voice on the other end was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. "There are men trying to break into the house," I whispered, afraid they might hear me. "I'm alone. Please, you have to send someone." "Stay calm, ma'am. Can you give me your location?" I rattled off the address, my eyes darting to the study door every few seconds. "Officers are on their way," the dispatcher assured me. "Is there a safe place you can hide until they arrive?" Before I could answer, a loud crash echoed through the house, the sound of shattering glass, followed by heavy footsteps. "They're inside," I gasped into the phone. "Oh God, they're inside." "Ma'am, find somewhere to hide. Don't confront them. Help is coming." I dropped the phone and looked around wildly. The study had no lock, no closet, nowhere to conceal myself. But there, behind a heavy bookcase, was a small door, a crawl space, a secret room. I didn't know and didn't care. It was my only option. I squeezed behind the bookcase, my hands slick with sweat as I fumbled with the tiny doorknob. It opened with a soft click, revealing a small, dusty space beyond. I crawled inside just as I heard footsteps approaching the study. Curled up in the darkness, I tried to control my breathing. Each inhale sounded deafening to my ears. Surely they would hear me. Surely they would find me. The study door creaked open. Heavy footsteps entered the room. "Check everywhere," a gruff voice commanded. "The boss wants those documents, and he wants them tonight." "Documents? What documents?" My confusion momentarily overshadowed my fear. What could my aunt possibly have that these men wanted so badly? I heard them rummaging through the desk, pulling out drawers, shuffling papers. Books thudded to the floor as they searched the shelves. "Nothing here," one of them grunted. "You sure this is the right place?" "Has to be. Keep looking." They were getting closer to my hiding spot. I could see slivers of light through the cracks in the door as they moved around the room. My grip tightened on the knife. If they found me, I'd go down fighting. A beam of light swept across the door, a flashlight. They were right on the other side. "Hey, what's this?" My heart stopped. Had they found the door? But the footsteps moved away towards the desk. "Looks like some kind of safe behind this painting. Jackpot." Their excitement was palpable. Whatever they were looking for, they thought they'd found it. I allowed myself a small spark of hope. Maybe they'd take what they wanted and leave. The sound of sirens in the distance shattered that hope. "Shit, cops! Grab what you can, we gotta go!" The room exploded into frantic activity. I heard the sound of tearing paper, hurried footsteps, muffled curses. Then, as quickly as they come, they were gone. I stayed frozen in my hiding spot, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. The sirens grew louder, then stopped. Car doors slammed. Voices called out, "Police! Is anyone inside?" Tears of relief streamed down my face as I pushed open the tiny door. I crawled out from behind the bookcase, my legs shaky, my whole body trembling. "In here," I called out, my voice hoarse. "I'm in here." The next few hours passed in a blur. Police swarmed the house, taking my statement, dusting for fingerprints, photographing the mess left behind. I learned that the men had escaped, disappearing into the woods before the police arrived. But they'd left evidence behind. Muddy footprints, a dropped burner phone, and the torn documents they'd been so desperate to find. As dawn broke, I sat on the porch steps, a shock blanket draped over my shoulders. A kind-faced detective sat next to me, his notebook open. "You did good," he said softly. "Real good. Not many people would have kept their cool like that." I managed a weak smile. I didn't feel very cool. I was terrified. "That's natural. But you stayed smart, stayed hidden. That's what matters." He paused, flipping through his notes. "Now about these documents they were after. Your aunt ever mentioned anything about them? Anything that might be valuable or sensitive?" I shook my head. "No, never. I'm just house-sitting. I don't know anything about her business or whatever this was." The detective nodded, jotting something down. "We'll need to speak with her, of course. This may be part of something bigger." As he stood to leave, a thought struck me. "Detective? Do you think... will they come back?" He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "We'll have officers patrolling the area just in case. But honestly, my gut says no. Whatever they were after, I think they got it. Or at least enough of it." His words were meant to be reassuring, but as I watched him walk away, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air, because deep down, I knew he was wrong. They would be back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow. But someday when we least expected it, they would return, and next time they might not leave witnesses behind. The forest had always been my sanctuary, a place of peace and solitude. But on that crisp autumn day, as the leaves crunched beneath my boots, I stumbled upon a scene that would haunt me for the rest of my life. In the span of a heartbeat, my solo hiking trip turned into a desperate fight for survival. I'd set out early that morning, eager to tackle a new trail I'd discovered in a remote corner of the national forest. The air was cool and invigorating, filled with the earthy scent of decaying leaves and pine. I'd been hiking for hours, relishing the quiet and the gentle exercise, when I heard voices in the distance. At first I thought nothing of it. Other hikers, probably. But as I got closer, the tone of the voices made me pause. They were hushed, urgent, with an undercurrent of tension that set my nerves on edge. Curiosity got the better of me. I moved forward carefully, stepping lightly to avoid making noise. The voices grew louder and I could make out snippets of conversation. "Hurry up, we need to finish this before anyone comes around. It's deep enough. Just do it already." I crouched behind a large oak tree, peering around its trunk. What I saw made my blood run cold. 5 men stood in a small clearing, surrounding a freshly dug hole. 4 of them were dressed in dark clothing, their faces hard and expressionless. The 5th man, older than the rest, was on his knees at the edge of the hole. Even from a distance, I could see the terror in his eyes. One of the standing men pulled out a gun. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not now. I had to be imagining things. But the sharp crack of the gunshot left no room for doubt. The kneeling man slumped forward, toppling into the hole. The others quickly began shoveling dirt over him. My mind reeled. I'd just witnessed a murder. These men were burying a body right in front of me. I needed to get out of there, to find help, to do something. But I was frozen in place, terror rooting me to the spot. As the men worked, one of them glanced up, scanning the trees. For a heart-stopping moment, his gaze seemed to lock onto mine. I ducked back behind the tree, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. "Did you see something?" I heard one of them ask. Thought I did. Probably just an animal. "Check it out. We can't take any chances." Panic surged through me. I had to move now. Staying low, I began to creep away from the clearing, trying to put as much distance between myself and the killers as possible. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sounded like an explosion in the quiet forest. I heard footsteps behind me, getting closer. They were coming. They knew someone was here. I abandoned all pretense of stealth and ran. Branches whipped at my face as I tore through the underbrush, my lungs burning with each desperate breath. I could hear them shouting now, their voices filled with anger and alarm. "Over there, I see someone." A gunshot rang out, splintering the bark of a tree inches from my head. I changed direction, zigging and zagging through the trees, trying to make myself a harder target. My foot caught on an exposed root, sending me sprawling. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. For a moment I lay there, dazed and gasping for air. The sound of approaching footsteps jolted me back to reality. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain in my ankle, and limped forward. I needed to find somewhere to hide, somewhere they couldn't find me. Up ahead, I spotted a dense thicket of bushes. It wasn't much, but it was my only option. I dove into the bushes, thorns scratching my skin as I burrowed deeper. Through the leaves, I could see the men spreading out, searching methodically through the area. "Find them," one of them barked. "Whoever it is, they can't have gotten far." I held my breath as one of the men passed within feet of my hiding spot. He paused, looking around carefully, his gun held ready. I could see the cold determination in his eyes. If he found me, he wouldn't hesitate to pull the trigger. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My muscles cramped from holding still for so long, but I didn't dare move. The slightest rustle could give me away. Eventually, their voices grew more distant. They were moving away, expanding their search area. I allowed myself a tiny sigh of relief, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. I had to get out of these woods and find help. Slowly, painfully, I extracted myself from the bushes. My clothes were torn, my skin scratched and bleeding, but I was alive. That was what mattered. I tried to orient myself, to figure out which direction would lead me back to the trailhead. But in my panic, I'd lost all sense of direction. The trees all looked the same, the landscape unfamiliar and threatening. My phone, I could use it to call for help or at least check my GPS. I pulled it out of my pocket, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. No signal. Of course, I was too deep in the wilderness. A twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. Nothing, just the wind in the trees. But the sound galvanized me into action. I couldn't stay here. I had to keep moving. I picked a direction and started walking, trying to move as quietly as possible while still covering ground quickly. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. The forest that had once been so welcoming now felt oppressive and dangerous. As I walked, my mind raced. What would happen if they caught me? Would they kill me too, bury my body next to their other victim? Or would they try to take me alive, to find out what I'd seen and who I might have told? The thought spurred me on, pushing me to ignore the pain in my ankle and the burning in my lungs. I had to survive. I had to tell someone what I'd witnessed. The sun was starting to dip below the tree line when I finally heard the sound of running water. A river. If I could find it, I could follow it downstream. Rivers often led to roads or towns. I changed course, heading towards the sound. The terrain became steeper, more treacherous. I had to climb over fallen logs and skirt around deep ravines, but the sound of water grew louder, spurring me on. Finally, I broke through the tree line and saw the river below. It was wide and fast-moving, its waters dark in the fading light. Relief flooded through me. I'd found a way out. I was so focused on the river that I almost missed the sound of voices coming from upstream. My blood ran cold. They were still out there, still searching. I looked around frantically for somewhere to hide. There, a few yards away, was a small overhang created by erosion under the riverbank. I hurried towards it, my feet slipping on the damp earth. I just ducked under the overhang when I saw them, two of the men from the clearing, making their way along the riverbank. They were moving slowly, carefully scanning the area. I pressed myself against the dirt wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. They were going to walk right past me. If they looked down, if they decided to check under the overhang, I was done for. My whole body trembled as they approached. I could hear their footsteps, could smell the acrid scent of cigarette smoke. One of them paused right above me. "See anything?" he called to his companion. "Nah, you..." There was a long pause. I didn't breathe, didn't move, didn't even blink. "Nothing. Come on, it's getting dark. Boss wants us back." Their footsteps receded, but I stayed frozen in place. It wasn't until the forest had been silent for several minutes that I finally allowed myself to move. I crawled out from under the overhang, my legs shaky and weak. The reality of how close I'd come to being caught hit me like a physical blow. I sank to my knees, my whole body shaking with delayed shock and fear. But I couldn't stay there. Night was falling, and I was still in danger. I forced myself to my feet and began following the river downstream, staying close to the tree line in case I needed to hide again. I walked through the night, jumping at every sound, terrified that at any moment I'd hear footsteps behind me. But slowly, gradually, the sounds of civilization began to reach me. The distant hum of traffic, the bark of a dog. As dawn broke, I stumbled out of the forest and onto a road. A passing driver, seeing my battered and disheveled state, stopped to help. Within hours, I was sitting in a police station recounting my harrowing experience to a room full of grim-faced officers. They believed me. Search parties were sent out, and eventually they found the clearing and the freshly dug grave. The men were caught. A vast criminal operation exposed and dismantled. But even now, months later, I can't shake the memory of that day. The crack of the gunshot, the cold eyes of the killers as they searched for me, the overwhelming terror of being hunted. I don't go hiking anymore. The forest, once my sanctuary, has become a place of nightmares. But sometimes in my darkest moments, I wonder if a part of me is still out there, still running, still hiding, forever trapped in that endless, terrifying chase. The night shift at Joe's Diner was usually quiet, filled with nothing more exciting than the occasional drunk trucker or insomniac college student. But on that foggy Tuesday night, as the clock ticked past 2 a.m., 5 men walked in and turned my world upside down. I never imagined that pouring coffee could be a matter of life and death. I'd been working at Joe's for about 6 months, picking up the graveyard shift to help pay for nursing school. The pay wasn't great, but the tips were decent, and I liked the solitude. Most nights it was just me, the cook in the back, and a handful of regulars. That night started like any other. I was wiping down the counter, half listening to the local news droning on the ancient TV mounted in the corner. The bell over the door jingled, and I looked up, plastering on my best customer service smile. 5 men sauntered in, laughing and talking loudly. Something about them set me on edge immediately. They were dressed too nicely for our little diner, all expensive suits and shiny shoes. Their eyes darted around the place, taking in every detail, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were sizing us up. "Evening, gentlemen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What can I get for you?" The one in front, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, fixed his gaze on me. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Coffee," he barked, "and keep it coming." I nodded and turned to grab the coffee pot, grateful for the chance to compose myself. As I poured their cups, I watched them out of the corner of my eye. They were huddled close, speaking in low voices, occasionally glancing towards the door. There were only 2 other customers in the diner, an elderly couple in a booth near the window. They were regulars, always came in for a late-night slice of pie. I could see them eyeing the newcomers nervously. As I set down the last coffee cup, the man with the scar grabbed my wrist. His grip was like iron. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Sarah," I said, trying to pull away. His grip tightened. "Sarah," he repeated, drawing out the syllables. "Pretty name for a pretty girl. You work here often, Sarah?" Before I could answer, one of his companions let out a harsh laugh. "Leave her alone, Jack. We ain't here for that." Jack released my wrist, but his eyes lingered on me in a way that made my skin crawl. I retreated behind the counter, my heart pounding. For the next hour, I tried to go about my duties as normally as possible, but the atmosphere in the diner had changed. The men grew louder, more aggressive. They made crude jokes, threw sugar packets at each other, and kept demanding refills. I noticed the elderly couple finishing up their pie, looking increasingly uncomfortable. As they stood to leave, one of the men blocked their path. "Leaving so soon?" he sneered. "Why don't you stay a while? We're just getting started." The old man tried to step around him. "Please, we'd like to go home now." "Home?" Another of the men chimed in. "What's the rush? Night's still young." I saw the fear in the old woman's eyes and knew I had to intervene. "Gentlemen," I said, forcing cheerfulness into my voice, "how about some more coffee? On the house." It worked, momentarily distracting them. The couple hurried out, the bell jingling their departure. But now the men's full attention was on me. Jack sauntered up to the counter, leaning in close. "That was real nice of you, Sarah. But now we're going to need something stronger than coffee." "I'm sorry, we don't serve alcohol here," I said, taking an involuntary step back. His eyes narrowed. "That's not what I heard. Word is old Joe keeps a special stash for his favorite customers, and we're feeling real special tonight." I shook my head. "There's no alcohol here, just coffee and food." Jack's hand shot out, grabbing my shirt and pulling me close. "Don't lie to me, girl. We know all about this place. Now you're going to get us that booze, or things are going to get real unpleasant." Fear coursed through me. I could smell the alcohol on his breath, see the dangerous glint in his eyes. These men were trouble, and I was alone with them. "Let her go," a gruff voice called out. I turned to see Mike, our cook, standing in the kitchen doorway. He was holding a large knife, his face set in grim determination. Jack released me, turning to face Mike with a smirk. "Well, look at this, the knight in shining armor. You gonna stop us, old man?" Mike stepped forward, the knife steady in his hand. "I'm calling the cops. You boys need to leave. Now." For a moment I thought they might listen. Then Jack lunged forward, knocking the knife from Mike's hand. The other men sprang into action, overturning tables and throwing chairs. I ducked behind the counter, fumbling for my phone. With shaking hands, I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? "Please help," I whispered. "Joe's Diner on Highway 5. There are men here, they're violent. They're attacking the cook. Please hurry." I ended the call just as a hand grabbed my arm, yanking me up. It was one of Jack's friends, his face twisted in anger. Calling for help, are we? He snarled. That wasn't very smart. He dragged me out from behind the counter. The diner was in chaos. Tables were overturned. Broken glass littered the floor. Mike was on the ground, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. Jack stood over him, grinning. Looks like your backup didn't work out so well, Jack said, turning his attention back to me. Now, about that alcohol. I knew I had to stall. The police were on their way, but who knew how long it would take them to arrive? We were pretty isolated out here on the highway. Okay, I said, my voice shaking. Okay, I'll show you where it is. Just don't hurt anyone else. Jack's grin widened. Smart girl. Lead the way. I moved slowly towards the back of the diner, my mind racing. There was no secret stash of alcohol. Joe ran a clean place, but maybe if I could get them into the storeroom, I could lock them in. As we reached the storeroom door, I heard sirens in the distance. Jack heard them too. His face darkened. You little bitch, he growled. You called the cops. He raised his hand to strike me, but at that moment the diner's front window exploded in a shower of glass. Red and blue lights flooded the restaurant. Police. Hands where we can see them. Everything happened so fast after that. The men tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. Officers swarmed in, weapons drawn. I saw Jack being slammed against a wall, handcuffs clicking into place. Someone wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, led me outside. The cool night air hit me, and suddenly I was shaking uncontrollably. The adrenaline that had kept me going was wearing off, leaving me weak and terrified. I gave my statement to a kind-faced officer, watching as the men were loaded into police cars. Mike was being tended to by paramedics. He caught my eye and gave me a weak thumbs up. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over the battered diner, I sat on the curb, clutching a cup of truly awful police station coffee. The officer who had taken my statement approached, squatting down beside me. You did good in there, he said softly. Real good. Not many people would have kept their cool like that. I managed a weak smile. I was terrified. That's natural. But you stayed smart, kept your head. You probably saved lives tonight. He paused, flipping through his notebook. Turns out these guys are wanted in connection with a string of robberies across 3 states. They've been hitting isolated places, terrorizing people. Thanks to you, we caught them. I nodded, not really processing his words. All I could think about was how close we had come to real tragedy. How different things could have been if I hadn't made that call, if the police hadn't arrived when they did. The sun was fully up by the time I finally left the diner. Joe had shown up, his face pale with shock as he surveyed the damage. He hugged me tightly, thanking me over and over for my quick thinking. As I drove home, exhausted and still shaken, I realized that my quiet nights at the diner were over. The world suddenly seemed a lot darker, a lot more dangerous than it had just hours before. But I also felt a strange sense of pride. I had faced true danger and come out the other side. I had protected myself and others. Maybe, just maybe, I was stronger than I had ever given myself credit for. I never worked another night shift at Joe's, but every now and then I stop by for a slice of pie and a cup of coffee. And as I sit in that familiar booth, I remember the night that changed everything. The night I learned that sometimes the most ordinary places can become battlegrounds, and the most ordinary people can become heroes. I never thought a cheap motel room key could be a death sentence, but as I stood there staring down the barrel of a gun, I realized how quickly a simple road trip can turn into a fight for survival. It was supposed to be a routine drive across the country. I'd been on the road for days, making my way from California to New York for a new job. The monotony of endless highways and fast food stops had become my new normal. So when I saw the flickering neon sign of the Pinewood Motel just off the highway in rural Kentucky, I didn't think twice about pulling in. The place was a dump, if I'm being honest. Peeling paint, a pothole-riddled parking lot, and a sign missing a few letters. But after 12 hours of driving, it looked like the Ritz-Carlton to my tired eyes. The manager barely looked up from his ancient TV as I walked in. He was a burly guy with a thick beard and even thicker accent. "Room for the night?" he grunted. I nodded, stifling a yawn. "Just passing through." He slid a key across the counter, an actual metal key, not one of those modern key cards. "Room 7, checkout's at 11. I trudged to my room, the key feeling heavy in my hand. The door creaked open, revealing a space that had last been updated sometime during the Carter administration. But it had a bed and a shower, and that's all I cared about. I was just about to collapse onto the musty comforter when a sharp knock at the door made me jump. Confused, I opened it, expecting to see the manager. Instead, I found myself face to face with three men I'd never seen before. The one in front, a tall guy with a scar running down his cheek, smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "Evening, friend. Mind if we come in?" Before I could respond, they pushed past me into the room. The door slammed shut behind them, and I felt my heart rate skyrocket. The tall one pulled out a gun, pointing it casually in my direction. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the bed. "We need to have a chat." I sank onto the bed, my legs suddenly feeling like jelly. "Look, I don't want any trouble. If it's money you want, I don't have much, but..." The man with the gun cut me off with a harsh laugh. "We don't want your money. We want information. Now tell us who you're working for." I blinked, confusion momentarily overriding my fear. "Working for? I'm just passing through. I'm on my way to New York for a new job." The second man, shorter but built like a linebacker, stepped forward. "Don't play dumb. We know you're involved." "The boss has been expecting you." My mind raced. They clearly thought I was someone else. Someone involved in... what? Some kind of criminal activity? "I swear you've got the wrong person. I'm just a regular guy on a road trip. Check my ID, my car, anything." The third man, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Maybe he's telling the truth, Jack. He doesn't look like the type." Jack, the one with the gun, shook his head. "Can't take that chance. Boss said someone would be coming through, staying at this motel. Said they'd have sensitive information. That's you, pal." I felt a bead of sweat trickle down my back. "It's not me. Please, this is all a huge misunderstanding." Jack's eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that. Get up. You're coming with us." They marched me out to a waiting van, keeping the gun pressed against my back. As we drove away from the motel, my mind raced with possible escape scenarios, each more unlikely than the last. After what felt like hours, but was probably only about 30 minutes, we pulled up to an old warehouse. They blindfolded me before leading me inside, the smell of dust and mold filling my nostrils. When they removed the blindfold, I found myself in a dimly lit room tied to a chair. Jack loomed over me, his scarred face twisted into a sneer. "Last chance," he growled. "Tell us what you know, or things are going to get real unpleasant." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've told you everything. I'm not who you think I am. My name is David Larson. I'm 28 years old. I'm moving to New York to start a job as an accountant. I have no idea what information you're talking about." Jack exchanged glances with his companions. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of doubt in their eyes. But then Jack's face hardened. "If that's how you want to play it, fine. We've got ways of making you talk." The next few hours were a blur of fear and pain. They asked me questions I couldn't answer, demanded information I didn't have. I lost track of time, my world narrowing to the small, dusty room and the relentless interrogation. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, the door burst open. A new man entered, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the dingy surroundings. The others immediately straightened up, a mix of respect and fear on their faces. "What the hell is going on here?" the newcomer demanded. Jack stepped forward. "Boss, we caught the guy you told us about. He was at the motel just like you said. But he won't talk." The boss's eyes narrowed as he looked me over. "This isn't him, you idiots. This guy's nobody." A wave of relief washed over me, quickly followed by a surge of anger. "That's what I've been trying to tell them," I shouted, my voice hoarse. The boss turned to Jack, his voice dangerously quiet. "You grabbed the wrong person. Do you have any idea what you've done? The real courier will be long gone by now." Jack's face paled. But you said..." I said to watch for someone suspicious, not to kidnap the first person who checked in. The boss ran a hand through his hair, clearly agitated. "This is a mess, a big, fucking mess." He turned back to me, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Larson, is it? I apologize for this misunderstanding. My associates were a bit overzealous in their duties." I almost laughed at the absurdity of his polite tone. "Overzealous? They kidnapped me, tortured me." The boss nodded, looking almost embarrassed. Yes, well, that presents us with a bit of a problem. You see, we can't exactly let you go now that you've seen our operation. My momentary relief evaporated. But I don't know anything. I couldn't identify any of you. I don't even know where we are. I'm afraid that's not good enough, the boss said, shaking his head. He turned to Jack. Take care of this. Make it clean. As they untied me from the chair, my survival instinct kicked into overdrive. I knew if they got me out of this room, I was as good as dead. With strength born of desperation, I shoved Jack as hard as I could the moment my hands were free. He stumbled backwards, caught off guard. I didn't wait to see if he'd recover. I ran, barreling past the shocked men and out into a larger warehouse space. Shouts echoed behind me as I weaved between stacks of crates and old machinery. I had no idea where I was going, just that I needed to get out. My lungs burned, my muscles screamed in protest, but I kept running. I spotted a window, grimy but large enough to fit through. Without hesitation, I grabbed a nearby piece of metal and smashed it. The sound of breaking glass was like a starting gun. I could hear my pursuers getting closer. I dove through the window, feeling shards of glass scrape my skin. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me, but I couldn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and ran into the night. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing in a dense patch of woods. As I lay there, gasping for breath, I strained my ears for any sign of pursuit, but all I heard was the normal sounds of the night crickets, rustling leaves, my own pounding heartbeat. When I felt I could move again, I carefully made my way through the woods. I had no idea where I was, but I knew I needed to find help. After what felt like hours, I saw lights in the distance, a gas station. The attendant looked alarmed when I stumbled in, covered in dirt and blood. But when I begged him to call the police, he didn't hesitate. The next few days were a whirlwind of police statements, hospital visits, and phone calls to my worried family. The police found the warehouse, but it had been cleaned out. No trace of the men who had held me captive. They never caught them. Sometimes I still look over my shoulder, half expecting to see Jack's scarred face in the crowd. But mostly, I've tried to move on with my life. I made it to New York eventually, started that new job. But I've never been able to shake the memory of that night. How quickly normalcy can shatter. How a simple misunderstanding can spiral into a nightmare. These days, I avoid motels. I don't take road trips anymore. And I always double-check the locks on my doors, because I know now how thin the line is between safety and danger, and how easily one can cross over to the other side. The crackling of the fireplace should have been comforting. Instead, it only served to mask the sound of our captors' footsteps as they paced outside the cabin door. What had started as an idyllic family getaway had turned into a hostage situation, with my wife, 2 kids, and I caught in the crosshairs of desperate fugitives. We'd been planning this vacation for months. A week in a secluded cabin, nestled deep in the mountains, away from the bustle of city life and the constant ping of email notifications. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just us, nature, and quality family time. It was supposed to be perfect. The first 2 days were everything we'd hoped for. We hiked trails, roasted marshmallows, and spent evenings playing board games by lamplight. Our kids, Tommy and Sarah, aged 10 and 8, were having the time of their lives, free from the usual distractions of tablets and TV. It was on the 3rd night that everything changed. We'd just finished dinner and were settling in for a game of Monopoly when we heard it, the sound of a car engine growing louder as it approached the cabin. I frowned, exchanging a puzzled look with my wife, Lisa. We weren't expecting visitors, and the rental company had assured us we'd have complete privacy. "I'll check it out," I said, moving towards the window. But before I could reach it, the front door burst open with a resounding crack. 3 men rushed in, brandishing guns. My heart leapt into my throat as I instinctively moved to shield my family. "Don't move," the leader shouted, his wild eyes darting around the cabin. "Nobody make a sound." Tommy let out a frightened whimper, and Sarah clung to Lisa, burying her face in her mother's shirt. I held up my hands, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "Please," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the fear coursing through me. "We don't want any trouble. Take whatever you want and go." The leader, a tall man with a scraggly beard, let out a harsh laugh. "Ain't that simple, friend? We need a place to lay low, and looks like you folks are going to be our gracious hosts for a while. As the reality of our situation sank in, I felt a cold dread settle in the pit of my stomach. These men weren't simple burglars. They were on the run, desperate and dangerous. Over the next few hours, we learned bits and pieces of their story. They'd robbed a bank 2 states over and had been fleeing ever since. Our remote cabin was the perfect hiding spot while they waited for things to cool down. They herded us into the main bedroom, binding our hands with zip ties and ordering us to sit on the floor. I winced as the plastic cut into my wrists, but I was more concerned about my family. Tommy was trying to be brave, his jaw set in a determined line, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Sarah had gone eerily quiet, her small body trembling against Lisa's side. "It's going to be okay," I whispered, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We'll get through this." Lisa nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. We both knew the statistics, the grim outcomes of many hostage situations. But we had to stay strong, for the kids. The night stretched on endlessly. The men took turns keeping watch, their low voices and occasional laughter a constant reminder of our predicament. I tried to keep track of time, to formulate some kind of plan, but my thoughts kept scattering like leaves in the wind. As dawn broke, casting pale light through the bedroom window, I heard the men arguing in the living room. Their voices were hushed but intense, clearly disagreeing about their next move. "We can't stay here forever," one of them hissed. "The cops will find us eventually." "And what do you suggest?" the leader shot back. "We're in the middle of nowhere with no transportation. We leave now, we're sitting ducks." "What about them?" a third voice chimed in. My blood ran cold, knowing they were talking about us. "We can't just let them go when we leave. They'll talk." There was a long pause, and I held my breath, straining to hear their response. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," the leader finally said. "For now, we sit tight." As the day wore on, a strange sort of routine developed. The men would allow us bathroom breaks one at a time, always under close supervision. They gave us water and some of the snacks we brought for the trip, but it did little to ease the gnawing fear in our stomachs. I tried to engage them in conversation, hoping to humanize us in their eyes. I talked about our jobs, our lives back home, anything to remind them that we were people, not just obstacles. Sometimes they'd respond, even sharing bits of their own stories. But then they'd catch themselves, their expressions hardening as they remembered the roles we were all playing in this dangerous game. It was during one of these conversations that I noticed something, a flicker of doubt in the youngest captor's eyes. He couldn't have been more than 25, and it was clear this wasn't the life he'd envisioned for himself. I filed that information away, hoping it might be useful later. As night fell again, I knew we had to do something. We couldn't just wait for whatever grim fate our captors had in store for us. I caught Lisa's eye, tilting my head slightly towards the kids. She nodded, understanding my unspoken message. We needed a plan. When they took me for my next bathroom break, I decided to take a risk. As the young captor led me back to the bedroom, I stumbled deliberately, falling against him. "Sorry," I mumbled, using the moment of confusion to whisper quickly. "You don't have to do this. Help us, please." He stiffened, shoving me roughly back into the room without a word. But I saw the conflict in his eyes. The seed was planted. Hours passed, and I was beginning to lose hope. But then, in the dead of night, I heard soft footsteps approaching our door. The handle turned slowly, and the young captor slipped inside. "Be quiet," he whispered, pulling out a knife. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought this was the end. But then he moved behind me, sawing through the zip ties binding my wrists. "Why?" I breathed as he freed Lisa and the kids. "Because you're right," he said, his voice barely audible. "This isn't me, but you have to hurry. They'll realize I'm gone soon." We crept through the cabin, our hearts pounding so loudly I was sure the others would hear. As we reached the front door, a floorboard creaked beneath Tommy's foot. "Hey!" a shout came from the other room. "What's going on?" "Run!" our unlikely ally yelled, shoving us out the door. We sprinted into the darkness, the cool night air a shock after the stuffy cabin. I could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit behind us, but we didn't dare look back. We just ran, crashing through underbrush, our lungs burning with each desperate breath. I don't know how long we ran. It could have been minutes or hours. All I knew was that we had to keep moving, had to find help. Finally, through the trees, I saw lights, a highway. We stumbled onto the road, waving frantically at the approaching headlights. The car screeched to a halt, and a startled couple leaned out the window. "Please," Lisa gasped. "We need help. Call the police." The next few hours passed in a blur of police statements and paramedic checkups. We learned later that our captors had been apprehended trying to flee the area. The young man who helped us was arrested too, but his cooperation led to a reduced sentence. As we sat in the police station, wrapped in scratchy blankets and sipping lukewarm coffee, the reality of what we'd been through began to sink in. We were safe. We had survived. Tommy looked up at me, his eyes wide. "Dad," he said, his voice small, "can we go home now?" I pulled him close, feeling Lisa and Sarah press in on either side. "Yeah, buddy," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Let's go home." In the days and weeks that followed, we dealt with the aftermath of our ordeal. There were nightmares, therapy sessions, and a lingering jumpiness that took months to fade. But there was also a new appreciation for life, for safety, for the simple joy of being together. We never did finish that game of Monopoly. But somehow I don't think any of us mind. We found new ways to spend our evenings, talking, laughing, simply being present with each other. Because if our experience taught us anything, it's that life can change in an instant. And sometimes the most precious moments are the quiet ones, when you're surrounded by the people you love, safe in the knowledge that you're home. The soft hum of servers was usually a comfort, a white noise that filled the quiet nights at the data center. But on that fateful evening, as the lights flickered and died, that comforting hum gave way to an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. I never imagined that my boring night shift would turn into a fight to protect some of the world's most sensitive information and my life. I'd been working at Secure Data Solutions for about 2 years. It was a cushy gig, if a bit monotonous. My job was simple: monitor the systems, perform routine maintenance, and make sure nothing went wrong with the servers that housed data for some of the biggest corporations and government agencies in the world. Most nights, the hardest part of my job was staying awake. That night started like any other. I arrived for my shift at 10 p.m., nodded to the day guy as he left, and settled into my chair in the control room. Surrounded by monitors displaying various system metrics, I began my usual rounds of checks and updates. It was around 2 a.m. when things went sideways. I was halfway through a system diagnostic when the lights flickered. Once, twice, then darkness. The emergency generator should have kicked in immediately, but the room remained pitch black. My heart rate spiked as I fumbled for the flashlight I kept in my desk drawer. This wasn't just a power outage, something was very, very wrong. As the beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, I heard a noise that didn't belong, footsteps coming from the server room. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Nobody else was supposed to be here. Nobody else had clearance. I should have called for help right then. Should have hit the silent alarm or used the secure line to contact our security team. But curiosity and a misplaced sense of duty got the better of me. I had to see what was going on. Slowly, quietly, I made my way to the server room door. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out. I peered through the crack, and my blood ran cold. 4 men, dressed in black, were methodically working their way through the server racks. They moved with purpose, clearly knowing exactly what they were looking for. This wasn't some random break-in. This was a targeted attack. I watched, paralyzed, as one of them inserted a device into a server. A few keystrokes later, and I knew they were copying data. Stealing it. My mind raced, trying to figure out which client's information they might be after. The implications were staggering. A voice crackled over a radio, making me jump. "Team 2 report. Have you secured the package?" One of the men responded, his voice low. "Almost there. Another 5 minutes and we'll have everything." I had to do something. These guys were professionals and I was just an IT geek with a flashlight. But I couldn't just stand by and let them walk out with God knows what kind of sensitive information. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. The silent alarm. If I could just reach the control room, I could alert the authorities without them knowing. It was our best shot. I turned to creep back down the hallway and my heart nearly stopped. There, at the other end, was a 5th intruder. Our eyes met, and for a split second the world seemed to freeze. Then he shouted, "We've got company," and all hell broke loose. I ran, I'm not proud of it, but in that moment, self-preservation kicked in and I bolted. I could hear them behind me, their heavy footsteps echoing off the walls. I ducked into a side corridor, hoping to lose them in the maze-like layout of the facility. My lungs burned as I ran, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly. I could hear them shouting, spreading out to search for me. I needed a plan fast. I found myself in the backup generator room. The massive machines loomed in the darkness, silent and useless. Whatever these guys had done to knock out the power, they'd thought of everything. As I caught my breath, trying to think, a crazy idea began to form. These servers, they generated a lot of heat. That's why we had such an extensive cooling system, a system that right now wasn't running. If I could restart the generators and turn on just the cooling system without powering up the rest of the facility, the sudden temperature change might trigger the fire suppression system. It would buy me some time, maybe even drive the intruders out. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. I made my way to the control panel, thanking every deity I could think of for those boring training sessions that had drilled the startup procedures into my head. My hands shook as I flipped switches and turned dials, praying I was remembering the sequence correctly. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low groan, the generators rumbled to life. I quickly shut down every system except the cooling. Cold air began to blast through the vents. Now, I just had to wait and hope. I didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, I heard the first shouts of confusion. Then, the ear-splitting wail of the fire alarm. I allowed myself a small smile. It had worked, but my relief was short-lived. I heard footsteps approaching fast, and I knew my luck had run out. I looked around frantically for a weapon, anything to defend myself. My hand closed around a wrench just as the door burst open. Two of the intruders stormed in, their faces masks of fury. "You," one of them snarled. "You're gonna pay for that." I raised the wrench, trying to look braver than I felt. "Stay back," I warned, my voice shaking. "The authorities are on their way." They laughed, a harsh sound that sent chills down my spine. "Nice try, kid. But we've got at least 10 minutes before anyone shows up. Plenty of time to finish the job and deal with you." They advanced slowly, like predators cornering their prey. I backed up until I felt the cool metal of a generator against my back. This was it. I was out of options, out of clever plans. I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable. But then, a new sound cut through the chaos. Sirens growing louder by the second. The intruders' heads snapped towards the sound, their faces suddenly unsure. "Shit," one of them muttered. "How did they get here so fast?" I didn't waste the opportunity. With all my strength, I swung the wrench, catching the nearest guy on the side of the head. He went down hard. The other one lunged for me, but I ducked. Years of high school wrestling finally paying off. As we grappled, I could hear more sirens, shouts, the sound of breaking glass. The cavalry had arrived. "Police! Hands where we can see them!" The intruder shoved me away, his face a mask of desperation. For a moment, I thought he might try to fight his way out. But then his shoulders slumped in defeat. He raised his hands slowly. The next few hours passed in a blur. Police swarmed the facility, securing the scene and rounding up the intruders. I gave statement after statement, my voice growing hoarse as I recounted the night's events over and over. As dawn broke, I found myself sitting on the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over my shoulders. A detective approached, notepad in hand. "Mr. Chen," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I've got to say, you did one hell of a job tonight. Your quick thinking probably saved millions of dollars worth of data, maybe more." I managed a weak smile. "Just doing my job, I guess." He chuckled. "Well, your job just helped us catch a group of cyber terrorists we've been after for months. You should be proud." As he walked away, the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. I had faced down professional criminals, outsmarted them, and lived to tell the tale. It didn't feel real. My boss arrived shortly after, his face a mix of concern and relief. "James," he said, gripping my shoulder. "Are you all right?" When we got the alert, I feared the worst. I nodded, too exhausted for words. He smiled, shaking his head in disbelief. "I don't know how you managed it, but you saved us. You're a hero. Hero." The word echoed in my mind as I was finally allowed to go home. As I drove, the first rays of sunlight painting the sky, I thought about how differently the night could have gone, how close I had come to failure, to much worse. I'm not sure I'd call myself a hero. I was just a guy doing his job, facing an extraordinary situation. But I do know this. I'll never look at my boring night shift the same way again. Because now I know that sometimes the difference between a normal night and a life-changing event is just one flicker of the lights. The bass pulsed through my body, a rhythm that once felt exhilarating, but now only amplified my growing panic. As I scanned the sea of unfamiliar faces, searching desperately for my friends, I realized how quickly a night of celebration could spiral into a nightmare. I never imagined that accepting help from a stranger would lead me into the darkest corner of the festival grounds, and possibly my life. It was supposed to be the highlight of our summer. 3 days of music, freedom, and memories at Sunset Sound, one of the biggest festivals in California. My best friends and I had been planning this trip for months, saving every spare dollar and coordinating our outfits with an enthusiasm that bordered on obsessive. The first day was everything we dreamed of. We danced until our feet ached, belted out lyrics to our favorite songs, and basked in the electric atmosphere that only comes from being surrounded by thousands of like-minded music lovers. As the sun set on day one, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I remember thinking that life couldn't get any better than this. Day two started just as promising. We arrived early, eager to catch some of the smaller acts on the side stages. The crowds were thicker than the day before, and we had to hold hands to stay together as we navigated through the masses of people. It was during one of these migrations between stages that it happened. One moment I was gripping Megan's hand tightly as we pushed through a particularly dense crowd. The next, a surge of people separated us, and I found myself alone in a sea of strangers. I called out their names, Megan, Aisha, Tyler, but my voice was swallowed by the music and the chatter of the crowd. Panic began to set in as I realized I couldn't see any of them. I pushed my way to the edge of the crowd, hoping to spot them from higher ground. My heart raced as I stood on my tiptoes, craning my neck to search for any familiar face. But all I saw was an endless ocean of festival goers, each lost in their own world of music and revelry. I reached for my phone only to remember with a sinking feeling that the battery had died hours ago. We had all agreed to meet at the main stage if we got separated, but that was clear across the festival grounds. With no way to contact them and no idea which direction they might have gone, I felt utterly lost. That's when he appeared. Tall, with kind eyes and an easy smile, he seemed to materialize out of nowhere. "You look a little lost," he said, his voice cutting through my rising panic. "Everything okay?" I hesitated for a moment, years of stranger danger, warnings flashing through my mind. But something about his demeanor put me at ease. Maybe it was the festival wristband on his arm, marking him as one of us, or maybe it was just my desperation for any kind of help. "I got separated from my friends," I explained, hating how small and scared my voice sounded. "We were supposed to meet at the main stage if this happened, but I'm not sure how to get there from here." His smile widened. "No problem, I know a shortcut. It can get pretty confusing in here if you're not familiar with the layout. I'm Jake, by the way." "Emma," I replied, relief washing over me. "Thank you so much, you're a lifesaver." Jake started leading me through the crowd, navigating the maze of tents and stages with the confidence of someone who knew the place like the back of his hand. He kept up a steady stream of conversation as we walked, asking about the bands I'd seen and sharing his own festival experiences. It wasn't until we'd been walking for about 10 minutes that I started to feel uneasy. The crowds were thinning out and the music was growing fainter. We seemed to be heading towards the outskirts of the festival grounds, away from the main stages. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked, trying to keep the nervousness out of my voice. Jake glanced back at me, his smile never wavering. "Trust me, it's much quicker this way. Avoids all the main crowds." I wanted to believe him, but a nagging voice in the back of my mind was screaming that something was wrong. We were now in an area I didn't recognize at all, surrounded by storage containers and parked vehicles. The festive atmosphere had completely disappeared, replaced by an eerie quiet broken only by the distant thump of bass. "I think maybe we should head back," I said, stopping in my tracks. "This doesn't look right." Jake's demeanor changed in an instant. The kind smile vanished, replaced by a hard look that sent chills down my spine. "We're almost there," he said, his voice low and menacing. He reached out and grabbed my arm, his grip painfully tight. "Keep moving." Terror washed over me as the reality of my situation became clear. This wasn't a helpful stranger. This was a predator, and I had walked right into his trap. My mind raced, searching for a way out. I could scream, but would anyone hear me over the music? I could try to run, but to where? I didn't even know where I was anymore. Jake started pulling me towards one of the storage containers. My feet moved mechanically, my body on autopilot while my mind screamed in panic. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not now, not to me. We were just a few feet from the container when I heard it. A shout, followed by running footsteps. Jake's head snapped up, his eyes widening in surprise and anger. "Hey, get away from her." I turned to see a group of people running towards us. Festival security, their yellow jackets like beacons of hope in the gathering darkness. Jake's grip on my arm loosened for just a moment, and I seized the opportunity. I wrenched my arm free and ran towards the security guards, my legs shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. The next few minutes were a blur. Security surrounded Jake, who was now trying to play it off as a misunderstanding. I babbled out my story to a kind-faced woman in a security jacket, my words tumbling over each other in my haste to explain. They took Jake away in handcuffs, and I learned later that he was part of a group that had been targeting solo festival goers. The thought of what might have happened if security hadn't shown up when they did made me feel sick. The security team escorted me back to the main festival area where I was reunited with my friends. They had been frantically searching for me, and the relief on their faces when they saw me was palpable. We hugged and cried, the fear and tension of the past hour finally breaking. As we sat in the medical tent, sipping water and trying to process what had happened, I couldn't shake the feeling of violation, not just of my personal safety, but of the entire festival experience. What should have been a weekend of joy and music had been tainted by this brush with danger. But as I looked at my friends, saw the concern and love in their eyes, I felt a different kind of strength growing within me. We had come here together, and together we would get through this. The festival wasn't over, and I refused to let one evil person ruin it for me. The next day, our final day at Sunset Sound, we stuck together like glue. We danced, we sang, we laughed. But there was a new awareness in our enjoyment. We looked out for each other and for those around us with a vigilance born from experience. As the final notes of the closing act faded into the night, I stood with my arms around my friends, tears in my eyes. But they weren't tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of gratitude for the music, for the safety I now felt, and for the unbreakable bond between us that had only grown stronger through adversity. I learned a lot of lessons that weekend, about trust, about instincts, about the importance of true friendship. But perhaps the most important lesson was this: even in our darkest moments, there is light to be found. Sometimes it comes in the form of a security guard's yellow jacket. Sometimes it's in the unwavering support of friends. And sometimes it's in our own resilience, in our ability to face our fears and come out stronger on the other side. The festival may have ended, but its impact on me will last a lifetime. Every time I hear the songs we danced to that weekend, I'm reminded not of the fear I felt, but of the strength I discovered. And that, I think, is the real music that will play on in my heart forever. The stench of copper hit me before I even opened the door. In that moment, standing on the porch of the old farmhouse, I knew my routine home visit as a social worker had just become anything but routine. What I discovered inside would haunt me for years to come, and turn a simple check-in into a desperate fight for survival. I'd been a social worker for about 5 years, specializing in child welfare cases in rural areas. It wasn't an easy job by any means, but I found it rewarding. Most days, anyway. This particular case had been on my radar for a while. The Collins family, living on an isolated farm about an hour outside of town. There had been reports of neglect, but nothing concrete enough for immediate action. Just concerns from teachers about the kids coming to school hungry, or neighbors mentioning raised voices late at night. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when I pulled up to the farmhouse. The place looked run down, paint peeling and shutters hanging askew. But that wasn't unusual for the area. Times were tough for a lot of families out here. I knocked on the door, plastering on my most reassuring smile. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. A sense of unease began to creep over me. I'd called ahead to let them know I was coming. They should be expecting me. "Hello?" I called out. Mr. Collins? Mrs. Collins? It's Sarah from Child Services. I'm here for our scheduled visit. Silence. Then, so faint I almost missed it, a whimper. It sounded like it came from inside the house. My heart started to race. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I tried the doorknob, surprised to find it unlocked. As I pushed the door open, the coppery smell intensified. I knew that smell. Blood. Hello? I called again, my voice shaking slightly. Is anyone hurt? Do you need help? I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the dim interior. The living room was a mess. Furniture overturned, pictures knocked off the walls. And there, on the worn carpet, a dark stain that could only be blood. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out and call the police. But that whimper I'd heard. If someone was hurt, if a child was in danger, I couldn't just leave. I moved deeper into the house, my heart pounding so loud I was sure anyone hiding could hear it. The kitchen was in a similar state of disarray, drawers pulled out, broken dishes littering the floor. Then I heard it again, a soft, frightened sob coming from upstairs. It's okay, I called out, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. I'm here to help. You're safe now. I climbed the stairs slowly, hyper-aware of every creak and groan of the old wood. At the top, I saw 5 doors. 4 were open, revealing bedrooms and a bathroom, all showing signs of a violent struggle. The 5th door was closed. The sob came again, definitely from behind that closed door. I approached cautiously, every nerve in my body on high alert. I'm going to open the door now, I said softly. It's okay. You're safe. I turned the handle slowly and pushed the door open. It was a small bedroom, clearly belonging to a child. Crayon drawings covered the walls, and a small bookshelf overflowed with well-worn picture books. And there, huddled in the corner, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. Hi there, I said, kneeling down to her level. My name's Sarah. I'm here to help. Can you tell me your name? She looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear. Emily, she whispered. Hi, Emily. Can you tell me what happened? Where are your parents? Her lower lip trembled. The bad men came. They hurt Mommy and Daddy. They said they'd hurt me too if I made a sound. My blood ran cold. Bad men? Emily, are they still here? She shook her head. They left. But they said they'd come back. I needed to get us out of there. Now. Okay, Emily, we need to leave. Can you come with me? I promise I'll keep you safe. She nodded hesitantly and reached out her hand. I took it, marveling at how small and fragile it felt in mine. We made our way downstairs, Emily clinging to me tightly. As we reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard a sound that made my heart stop. A car engine, growing louder as it approached the house. Emily's grip on my hand tightened painfully. They're back, she whispered, terror evident in her voice. I looked around frantically, searching for a way out. The front door was out of the question. They'd see us immediately. The back door was our best bet, but we'd have to cross the kitchen to get there. And there was no guarantee they wouldn't come in that way. Making a split-second decision, I scooped Emily up and dashed for the basement door. It was our best chance at hiding until I could figure out a plan. We descended into the darkness, the musty smell of damp earth filling our nostrils. I set Emily down gently and fumbled for my phone, using its dim light to survey our surroundings. The basement was cluttered with old furniture and boxes, providing plenty of hiding spots. Emily, I need you to be very brave, I whispered. We're going to play a quiet game, okay? We need to stay very, very quiet, no matter what we hear. She nodded, her eyes wide in the phone's glow. I led her to a large old wardrobe and helped her inside, then squeezed in beside her. Just as I pulled the door closed, I heard the sound of the front door opening above us. Heavy footsteps moved across the floor overhead. Muffled voices drifted down, angry and impatient. Emily pressed closer to me, trembling. I wrapped my arm around her, silently praying that they wouldn't think to check the basement. Where the hell is she? A gruff voice shouted. You said she'd be here. She has to be, another voice replied. The brat couldn't have gone far on her own. Search the place again. My mind raced. They were looking for Emily. But why? What could they possibly want with a little girl? Whatever the reason, I knew I had to get her out of here and to safety. The footsteps moved upstairs, and I seized the opportunity. Slowly, carefully, I eased the wardrobe door open. "Emily," I whispered, "we're going to run now. As fast as we can. Don't look back, okay? Just run." She nodded, her face set in determination despite the fear in her eyes. I took her hand, and we crept out of our hiding spot. We had just reached the bottom of the basement stairs when a floorboard creaked overhead. They were coming back down. There was no time to hide again. I scooped Emily up and ran for the small basement window. It was our only chance. I set her down and tried to push it open, my hands shaking. It was stuck, years of paint sealing it shut. The basement door opened. "Hey!" a voice shouted. "There they are!" In desperation, I grabbed a nearby tool, a rusty hammer, and smashed the window. The glass shattered, and I quickly cleared away the shards. "Go, Emily," I urged, helping her through the narrow opening. As she scrambled out, I felt a hand grab my ankle. I kicked back hard, hearing a satisfying grunt of pain. Using every ounce of strength I had, I pulled myself through the window, feeling glass cut into my palms. We ran across the overgrown yard, the shouts of the men behind us spurring us on. The trees of the surrounding forest loomed ahead, offering the promise of cover. Just as we reached the tree line, I heard the distinctive sound of a gunshot. A bullet whizzed past, splintering the bark of a nearby tree. Adrenaline surged through me. I picked Emily up again, ignoring the burning in my muscles, and plunged deeper into the forest. Branches whipped at my face as I ran, but I didn't slow down. I could hear them crashing through the undergrowth behind us, getting closer. I don't know how long we ran. It felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, when my legs felt like they would give out, I spotted a dense thicket. It would have to do. I set Emily down and quickly ushered her into the bushes, following close behind. We huddled there, hardly daring to breathe as the men's voices grew closer. "Where'd they go?" "They can't have gotten far. The girl's just a kid, and the woman was bleeding." I looked down, realizing for the first time that my shirt was stained with blood from my cut hands. I pressed them against my legs, trying to stem the flow. Minutes passed like hours as we waited, frozen in fear. Gradually, the voices faded into the distance, but I didn't move. I couldn't risk it. It was full dark by the time I felt it was safe enough to leave our hiding spot. Emily had fallen into an exhausted sleep, and I gently woke her. "We need to go now," I whispered. "It's safe." We made our way slowly through the forest, every snapping twig making me flinch. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, we emerged onto a road. A passing driver, seeing our battered state, stopped to help. Within the hour, we were safe at the police station, Emily clinging to me as I recounted our harrowing escape. The full story came out in the days that followed. Emily's parents had witnessed a crime, a murder committed by a local gang. They were killed for their silence, and Emily was to be taken to ensure no one talked. As for me, I was hailed as a hero. But I didn't feel like one. I just felt lucky. Lucky that I had followed my instincts. Lucky that we had escaped. Lucky to be alive. I still work as a social worker, but now every time I approach a new house, I remember that day. I remember the smell of blood, the sound of gunshots, the feel of Emily's small hand in mine as we ran for our lives. And I'm reminded that in my line of work, routine can turn to danger in the blink of an eye. But I'm also reminded of the lives we can save, the children we can protect, and that makes it all worth it. The moment his thumb jutted out from the shadows, I knew I'd made a mistake. But by then, it was too late. The stranger was already climbing into my truck, and with him came a terror that would turn my simple act of kindness into a nightmarish fight for survival. It had been a long day on the road. I'd been driving since dawn, hauling a load of electronics from Reno to Salt Lake City. The monotony of the desert landscape had started to blur, each mile of highway indistinguishable from the last. That's when I saw him, a lone figure on the side of the road, thumb outstretched. I'm not usually one to pick up hitchhikers. Years on the road had taught me to be cautious, but something about this guy made me pause. Maybe it was the lateness of the hour, or the desolate stretch of highway. Whatever it was, I found myself easing off the gas and pulling onto the shoulder. As my truck ground to a halt, I got my first good look at him. He was younger than I expected, probably in his mid-20s, with a scruffy beard and clothes that had seen better days. A worn backpack hung from one shoulder. "Where you headed?" I called out, rolling down the passenger window. "Just down the road a bit," he replied, flashing a grateful smile. "Thanks for stopping, man. It's been a long day." I nodded, gesturing for him to hop in. As he climbed into the cab, I caught a whiff of cigarette smoke and something else I couldn't quite place. "Name's Mike," I said, extending a hand. "What brings you out to the middle of nowhere?" He shook my hand, his grip firmer than I expected. "Jake. And just trying to get home. Car broke down a few miles back." I pulled back onto the highway, the familiar rumble of the engine filling the silence. Jake seemed content to stare out the window, and I didn't push for conversation. The miles ticked by, the darkness outside broken only by the occasional passing car. It was Jake who finally broke the silence. "So, Mike, you've been driving long." "About 15 years now," I replied, glancing over at him. "It's a good life if you don't mind the solitude." He nodded, still staring out the window. "Must see a lot of interesting things out here." "Sometimes," I chuckled. "Though mostly it's just road and more road." Jake shifted in his seat, and that's when I saw it. Just a flash, really, as his jacket rode up. But there was no mistaking the glint of metal tucked into his waistband. My heart rate spiked, but I forced myself to keep my eyes on the road. Maybe I was seeing things. Maybe it wasn't what I thought, but deep down I knew. I'd just let an armed stranger into my truck. "So, Jake," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "where exactly is home for you?" He turned to look at me, and the easy smile from earlier was gone. His eyes were hard now, calculating. "Pull over," he said, his voice low and dangerous. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble. If you want me to let you out, I can—" I said, "Pull over," he shouted, and suddenly the gun was in his hand, pointed directly at me. My mind raced as I eased the truck onto the shoulder. This couldn't be happening. Not to me. Not out here in the middle of nowhere. All right, I said, raising one hand in a placating gesture while the other stayed on the wheel. "Just take it easy. Whatever you want, it's yours." Jake's laugh was harsh and humorless. What I want is for you to shut up and drive. We're taking a little detour." He gestured with the gun, indicating I should get back on the road. As I merged onto the highway, my mind was in overdrive. I needed to find a way out of this, and fast. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "You'll find out when we get there," Jake snapped. "Just keep driving and keep your mouth shut." The next hour was the longest of my life. We drove in tense silence, the only sound the rumble of the engine and the occasional crackle of my CB radio. I thought about trying to signal for help, but Jake's eyes never left me. One wrong move, and I knew he wouldn't hesitate to use that gun. Finally, he directed me to turn off onto a narrow dirt road. It wound through the desert, away from the highway and any hope of rescue. After a few miles, a ramshackle building came into view. It looked like an abandoned gas station, long since left to rot in the unforgiving desert sun. "Stop here," Jake ordered. I brought the truck to a halt, my hands shaking slightly on the wheel. Jake got out, keeping the gun trained on me as he walked around to my side. "Out," he barked, yanking open my door. As I climbed down from the cab, my foot slipped on the running board. I stumbled, nearly falling. It was just the distraction I needed. In that split second, I lunged at Jake, catching him off guard. We grappled for the gun, the cold metal burning in my grip as we struggled. Jake was stronger than he looked, but desperation lent me strength. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the quiet desert night. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then Jake crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. I stood there panting, the gun heavy in my hand. I couldn't believe what had just happened. Part of me wanted to run, to get back in my truck and drive as far and as fast as I could, but I knew I couldn't leave him there. With shaking hands, I checked for a pulse. It was there, weak but steady. The bullet had grazed his side, painful but not immediately life-threatening. I grabbed some rope from my truck and tied Jake up as best I could. Then I got on my CB radio and called for help, praying someone would hear me out here in the middle of nowhere. It felt like hours before I saw the flashing lights of approaching vehicles. Police cars and an ambulance appeared on the horizon, kicking up dust as they sped down the dirt road. The next few hours were a blur of questions and statements. I learned that Jake was wanted in connection with a string of armed robberies across 3 states. He'd been targeting lone truckers, forcing them to drive to isolated locations where his partners would be waiting to unload the cargo. As the sun began to rise, painting the desert in shades of pink and gold, a detective approached me. He looked tired but satisfied. "Mr. Thompson," he said, extending his hand, "I want to thank you for your bravery. You've helped us crack a case we've been working on for months." I shook his hand numbly, still trying to process everything that had happened. "I was just trying to survive," I mumbled. He nodded understandingly. "That's often when true bravery shows itself. You'll need to come down to the station to give a formal statement, but after that, you're free to go. Your cargo's safe, and your company's been notified." As I climbed back into my truck, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. I looked older somehow, the lines on my face deeper than I remembered. The events of the night had left their mark, not just physically, but deep inside me. I started the engine, the familiar rumble bringing a small measure of comfort. As I pulled back onto the highway heading towards Salt Lake City to finally deliver my cargo, I couldn't help but reflect on how quickly life can change. One moment, you're just another trucker on a long haul. The next, you're fighting for your life against an armed criminal. It was a stark reminder of the unpredictability of life on the road, and the dangers that can lurk behind a simple outstretched thumb. But as the miles rolled by and the sun climbed higher in the sky, I felt something else alongside the lingering fear and shock. A sense of pride, perhaps, or resilience. I had faced the unthinkable and come out the other side. I had survived. From that day on, every time I saw a hitchhiker on the side of the road, I'd feel a twinge of that old fear. But I'd also remember the strength I found within myself on that desert night. And I'd keep driving, eyes on the road ahead, ready for whatever it might bring. The creak of the floorboard outside our room shouldn't have been ominous. It was an old house after all. But when I heard the hushed whispers that followed, I knew our quaint bed and breakfast getaway had just become a waking nightmare. My wife and I had unwittingly checked into a den of secrets, and our hosts had plans that didn't include a complimentary breakfast. Sarah and I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. Both of us were buried in work, barely seeing each other despite living in the same house. This little getaway to a charming B&B in the countryside was supposed to be our chance to reconnect, to remember why we fell in love in the first place. We arrived late Friday afternoon, the gravel driveway crunching under our tires as we pulled up to the Victorian-style house. It was picture perfect, with its wraparound porch and gingerbread trim. An older couple, who introduced themselves as Martha and George, greeted us warmly at the door. "Welcome to Willow Creek Bed and Breakfast," Martha said, her smile wide and inviting. "We're so glad you could join us." George took our bags, insisting, despite my protests, that it was no trouble at all. As we followed them inside, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace wash over me. The interior was just as charming as the exterior, with antique furniture and the smell of freshly baked cookies in the air. Our room was on the 2nd floor, a spacious suite with a 4-poster bed and a view of the sprawling gardens behind the house. Sarah squeezed my hand, her eyes sparkling with excitement. For the first time in months, I saw the stress melt away from her face. We spent that evening exploring the grounds, walking hand in hand through the well-tended gardens. We talked about everything and nothing, rediscovering the easy conversation that had been lost in the chaos of our daily lives. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the landscape, I felt truly happy. Dinner was a quiet affair, just us and one other couple in the cozy dining room. Martha served us herself, each course more delicious than the last. The wine flowed freely, and by the time we retired to our room, we were both feeling warm and content. It was the middle of the night when I first heard it. A floorboard creaked, followed by hushed voices. In my half-asleep state, I initially dismissed it, but then I heard Martha's voice unusually sharp. "We have to do it tonight, George. We can't wait any longer." George's reply was too low for me to make out, but the urgency in Martha's next words sent a chill down my spine. "I don't care if you think it's too risky. If we don't act now, we'll lose everything." I lay there, fully awake now, straining to hear more. But the voices faded, followed by the sound of footsteps descending the stairs. I turned to Sarah, relieved to see she was still asleep. My mind raced with possibilities. What were they talking about? What did they have to do tonight? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were having financial troubles. Maybe they were planning to sell the B&B. But something in Martha's tone, the hidden edge beneath her earlier warmth, told me it was something far more sinister. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every creak, every distant sound had me on edge. When Sarah woke up, I debated whether to tell her about what I'd heard. But seeing her relaxed smile, I couldn't bring myself to shatter the peace of our getaway. Not yet. Not without more information. At breakfast, I watched Martha and George closely. They seemed normal, cheerful even, as they served us homemade waffles and fresh fruit. But now that I was looking for it, I could see the strain around Martha's eyes, the tightness in George's smile. "Did you sleep well?" Martha asked, refilling my coffee cup. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Like a log. It's so quiet out here." Was it my imagination, or did her hand shake slightly as she set down the coffee pot? After breakfast, Sarah wanted to go for a hike on one of the nearby trails. I agreed, glad for the chance to get out of the house and clear my head. But as we were preparing to leave, I made an excuse to run back up to our room. Once there, I quickly but thoroughly searched the space. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. A hidden camera, a listening device, anything to confirm my growing paranoia. I found nothing, but that didn't ease my anxiety. The hike was beautiful, the spring air crisp and invigorating. Sarah chatted happily about the birds we saw, the wildflowers blooming along the path. I tried to engage, to lose myself in the moment, but my mind kept wandering back to the overheard conversation. We returned to the B&B in the late afternoon. As we approached, I saw George hurriedly closing the doors of a shed behind the house. When he saw us, he waved a bit too enthusiastically. "Enjoy your hike," he called out. "It was lovely," Sarah replied. This whole place is just magical. If only she knew the dark undercurrent I'd sensed. That evening, Martha announced that she and George had to run into town for supplies. They'd be gone for a couple of hours, but we were welcome to help ourselves to anything in the kitchen if we got hungry. As soon as their car disappeared down the driveway, I turned to Sarah. "We need to talk," I said, my voice grave. I told her everything. The midnight conversation, my suspicions, the odd behavior I'd noticed. To her credit, she listened without interrupting, her expression growing more concerned with each word. "What do you think they're planning?" she asked when I finished. I shook my head. "I don't know. But whatever it is, it's happening tonight. And I don't think we should be here when it does." Sarah bit her lip, clearly torn. "But what if we're overreacting? What if it's nothing?" "And what if it's not?" I countered. "I'd rather feel foolish for leaving early than risk whatever they've got planned." After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. "Okay, let's pack up and go." We moved quickly, throwing our belongings into our suitcases. I kept an ear out for the sound of a returning car, my heart racing with each passing minute. We were just about to head downstairs when we heard it, the crunch of gravel under tires. They were back, much earlier than expected. "Quick," I whispered. "Back to the room. Act natural." We had just managed to shove our packed bags under the bed when a knock came at the door. I opened it to find Martha, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I hope we didn't disturb you," she said. "We forgot a few things, had to come back early." "No problem at all," I replied, hoping my voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Wonderful. Oh, and I wondered if you might help George with something in the shed? Just a bit of heavy lifting." My blood ran cold. The shed, where I'd seen George earlier, acting suspiciously. "Of course," I heard myself say. "Happy to help." As I followed Martha downstairs, I caught Sarah's eye. The fear I saw there mirrored my own. George was waiting by the shed, a shovel in his hand. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure they could hear it. "Right this way," George said, opening the shed door. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the gloom, and that's when I saw it, a hole in the dirt floor about the size of a grave. I turned to run, but George was blocking the doorway. "I'm sorry," he said, raising the shovel. "We really didn't want it to come to this." What happened next was a blur. I remember shouting, the sound of splintering wood as I charged at George. I remember running, Sarah's hand in mine as we sprinted for our car, the screech of tires as we peeled out of the driveway. We drove for hours, not stopping until we were several states away. Only Only then, in the harsh fluorescent light of a highway rest stop, did we finally break down. The reality of what we'd escaped, of how close we'd come to God knows what fate, hit us like a physical blow. We went to the police, of course, told them everything, but by the time they investigated, Martha and George were long gone. The B&B stood empty, no evidence of foul play except for that ominous hole in the shed floor. To this day, I don't know what their plan was. Maybe we interrupted some long-standing criminal enterprise. Maybe we were intended to be their next victims. Whatever the case, our idyllic getaway had turned into a brush with unimaginable danger. Sarah and I are closer now, bonded by our shared ordeal, but we've never stayed at another B&B. Some wounds, it seems, take longer to heal than others, and some quaint country inns hide secrets darker than we could ever imagine. The gentle rocking of the ferry had lulled most passengers to sleep, but for me, it was the calm before the storm. As I stood on the dimly lit deck, watching a group of men huddled in hushed conversation, I realized that this routine night crossing was about to become a fight for survival on the open sea. I hadn't planned on taking the midnight ferry. My day trip to the island was supposed to end with the 7 p.m. sailing, but a missed bus and a series of unfortunate delays left me sprinting onto the last ferry of the night, breathless and grateful just to be heading home. The ferry was larger than I expected for a late-night crossing, a behemoth of steel cutting through the dark waters. There weren't many passengers, a few truckers catching some sleep in their cabs, a handful of locals, and a group of men who seemed out of place in their crisp business attire. I found a quiet corner in the passenger lounge and settled in for the 3-hour journey. The gentle hum of the engines and the rhythmic slap of waves against the hull were soothing, and I felt my eyelids growing heavy. It must have been about an hour into the trip when I jolted awake, my bladder protesting the large coffee I'd downed earlier. Groggy and disoriented, I made my way to the restrooms near the rear of the ship. As I was returning to my seat, a snippet of conversation caught my attention. 2 of the men in suits were standing near the stairwell, their voices low but intense. "Can't wait any longer. It has to be tonight." "Are you sure everyone's in position?" "Positive. Once we reach the halfway point, we make our move." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. I quickened my pace, trying to appear nonchalant as I passed them. Their conversation ceased abruptly, and I could feel their eyes on me as I walked away. Back in my seat, my mind raced. What had I just overheard? It sounded like they were planning something that was going to happen on this ferry. But what? I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that I had misheard or misunderstood, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. I'd always prided myself on my intuition, and right now every instinct was screaming that something was very, very wrong. I decided to do a casual lap around the ferry just to ease my mind. As I walked, I counted the men in suits. There were 6 of them in total, spread out across the ship, but always within sight of each other. They seemed to be watching the few other passengers, their gazes calculating and cold. Near the life rafts, I overheard another fragment of conversation. "Disable the communications first. Can't risk them calling for help." My heart began to pound. This was real. These men were planning to take over the ferry. I needed to alert someone, but who? I hadn't seen any security personnel on board, and I was afraid to approach the captain directly in case one of the men saw me. I made my way to the purser's office, trying to appear calm. The purser, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked up as I entered. "Can I help you?" I leaned in close, keeping my voice low. "I think there's something wrong. I've overheard some men talking about disabling communications and taking control of the ship." Her eyes widened, but to her credit, she maintained her composure. "Are you certain?" I nodded emphatically. "I know it sounds crazy, but I'm sure. There are 6 of them, all in suits. They're spread out across the ship." She reached for the phone on her desk, but before she could dial, the lights flickered and went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, casting an eerie red glow throughout the ship. "It's starting," I whispered, fear clutching at my throat. The purser's face had gone pale. "We need to get to the bridge. Now." We left the office, moving as quickly as we dared, but we'd only made it halfway down the corridor when 2 of the men in suits appeared, blocking our path. "Going somewhere?" one of them asked, his voice menacing. The purser stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear I could see in her eyes. I need to check on the electrical systems. If you'll excuse us." "I don't think so," the other man said, pulling out a gun. "Both of you, turn around and start walking." My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. They marched us to the cargo hold, where we found the rest of the passengers and crew already gathered, fear evident on every face. One of the men, clearly the leader, stood before us. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the inconvenience. We've taken control of this vessel for our own purposes. Cooperate, and no one needs to get hurt." A murmur of panic rippled through the group. I scanned the faces, counting quickly. With a sinking feeling, I realized the captain and several crew members were missing. What had happened to them? The leader continued, "We'll be making a slight detour. Once we've reached our destination and completed our business, you'll all be free to go. Until then, I suggest you make yourselves comfortable." As he spoke, I noticed one of the other men fiddling with what looked like a signal jammer. That explained why no one had been able to call for help. Hours passed in tense silence. The ferry changed course, heading deeper into open waters. I tried to keep track of our captors' movements, looking for any weakness in their plan, any opportunity to act. It was nearing dawn when I saw my chance. Two of the men were arguing in hushed tones, distracted. The one guarding the door to the cargo hold looked drowsy, his eyes heavy-lidded. I leaned over to the purser, who had stayed close to me throughout the ordeal. "I think I can reach that life raft release lever," I whispered, nodding towards the mechanism near the door. "If I can deploy it, it might create enough of a distraction for someone to get to the bridge and call for help." She looked at me, fear and determination warring in her eyes. "It's risky, if they catch you." "We can't just sit here and wait," I insisted. "Who knows what they're planning?" After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. "Okay, I'll try to create a diversion. When I do, make your move." I watched, my nerves on edge, as she made her way towards the guard. She stumbled, falling against him with a cry of distress. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I think I've twisted my ankle." As the guard bent to help her up, I saw my opening. I darted towards the life raft release, my hand closing around the lever. With all my strength, I pulled. The klaxon blared, startlingly loud in the confined space. Shouts of confusion filled the air as the life raft deployed, splashing into the sea. In the ensuing chaos, I saw the purser slip out the door. Gunshots rang out, but in the confusion, their aim was wild. I dove behind a stack of crates, my heart pounding. Had the purser made it to the bridge? Would help come in time? The next few minutes were the longest of my life. The hijackers shouted orders, trying to regain control of the situation. I could hear them searching, getting closer to my hiding spot. Then, miraculously, new voices joined the fray. "This is the Coast Guard. Drop your weapons and surrender." Relief flooded through me, so intense it made me dizzy. As the sound of boots thundered down the stairs, I finally allowed myself to believe that we were saved. The aftermath was a blur of statements and medical checks. I learned that the hijackers had been part of an international smuggling ring, using passenger ferries to transport illegal goods. The purser had managed to reach the bridge and send out an SOS, guiding the Coast Guard to our location. As I finally stepped off the ferry, hours later than planned and utterly exhausted, a Coast Guard officer approached me. "Your quick thinking saved a lot of lives today," he said, shaking my hand. "You should be proud." I managed a weary smile. "I'm just glad it's over." But as I watched the ferry, now crawling with law enforcement, I knew it wasn't really over. The memory of that night would stay with me forever. The fear, the uncertainty, but also the knowledge that ordinary people can find extraordinary courage when it matters most. I've taken many ferry rides since then. Each time, as I feel the engines rumble to life and the shore begins to recede, I'm reminded of that harrowing night. But I also remember the strength I found within myself, the bonds forged with strangers in the face of danger. And I know that whatever rough waters lie ahead, I have the resilience to weather the storm. The sound of breaking glass shattered the quiet night, and in that moment I knew the children weren't safe. What had started as a routine babysitting job had suddenly become a desperate struggle to protect two innocent lives from a danger I never saw coming. I'd been babysitting for the Seabrooks for about 6 months. They were a nice couple, David, a successful lawyer, and his wife Maria, a pediatrician. Their kids, Emma, 8, and Jake, 6, were sweet and well-behaved. It was an easy gig and the pay was good. Perfect for a college student like me trying to make ends meet. That Friday night seemed like any other. The Seabrooks were headed to a charity gala in the city, dressed to the nines. As Maria rattled off the usual instructions, emergency numbers on the fridge, bedtimes, no sugar after 8 p.m., I nodded along, having heard it all before. But then David pulled me aside, his expression unusually serious. "Listen, Sarah," he said in a low voice. "If anything seems off tonight, anything at all, I want you to call the police immediately. Don't hesitate." I blinked, taken aback. "Is everything okay, Mr. Seabrook?" He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, it's probably nothing. Just keep an eye out, okay?" Before I could press further, Maria called for him, and they were out the door with a flurry of goodbye kisses for the kids. I stood there for a moment, unsettled by David's warning. What could he possibly be worried about? I pushed the thought aside and focused on the kids. We had dinner, played a few board games, and then settled in for a movie. As the credits rolled, I ushered them upstairs for bed. Emma went down easily, but Jake was being fussy. "Can you leave the hall light on?" he asked, his big brown eyes pleading. "Sure, buddy," I said, ruffling his hair. "Any particular reason?" He hesitated, then whispered, "I saw a scary man outside my window last night." A chill ran down my spine as I remembered David's warning. "What do you mean, Jake? What did the man look like?" "He had a beard," Jake said, pulling the covers up to his chin. "And a hat. He was just standing there, watching." I tried to keep my voice calm. "It was probably just a shadow, Jake. But tell you what, I'll double-check all the doors and windows, okay? Nothing to worry about." He nodded, seeming reassured, and I tucked him in. But as I walked downstairs, my heart was pounding. Was this what David had been worried about? I did a thorough check of the house, making sure every door and window was locked. The Seabrooks lived in an upscale neighborhood, their large house set back from the street and surrounded by well-manicured gardens. It should have felt safe, but now every shadow seemed menacing. As I settled onto the couch with a book, trying to calm my nerves, I heard a noise from outside, a soft scraping sound, like someone trying to be quiet but not quite succeeding. I froze, straining my ears. There it was again, coming from the back of the house. My mouth went dry. I stood up slowly, my mind racing. What should I do? Call the police? But what if it was nothing? I'd feel like an idiot if cops showed up for a raccoon in the trash cans. I crept to the kitchen window, peering out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. Then a movement caught my eye. A figure dressed in dark clothing was crouched by the back door, fiddling with the lock. My heart leapt into my throat. This was really happening. Someone was trying to break in. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking as I pulled out my phone. Just as I was about to dial 911, I heard it. The sound of breaking glass, followed by a muffled curse. They were inside. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced it down. The kids. I had to protect the kids. I raced upstairs, taking the steps two at a time. I burst into Jake's room first, clamping a hand over his mouth as he startled awake. "Shh," I whispered. "We need to be very quiet. We're going to play a hiding game, okay?" His eyes were wide with fear, but he nodded. I scooped him up and hurried to Emma's room. She was already sitting up in bed, alerted by the noise. "Sarah, what's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We need to hide," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Remember the secret place your dad showed you? In the attic?" Emma nodded, suddenly looking very young and scared. I ushered them towards the hidden panel in the hallway that led to a small attic space. It was meant as a fun hideout for the kids, but now it might save their lives. As I helped them climb up, I heard heavy footsteps downstairs. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. "Stay here," I whispered to the kids. "Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear. I'm going to get help." Emma grabbed my arm. "Don't leave us," she pleaded, tears in her eyes. I swallowed hard. I have to. But I promise I'll come back for you. You need to be brave now, okay? Take care of your brother." With a final look at their frightened faces, I closed the panel. It blended seamlessly with the wall. Unless you knew it was there, you'd never find it. I could hear the intruders ransacking the house below. They were speaking in low voices, but I couldn't make out the words. I had to get to a phone, call for help. Slowly, carefully, I crept down the stairs. My phone was still on the coffee table in the living room. If I could just reach it. I made it to the bottom of the stairs when a floorboard creaked under my foot. The voices stopped abruptly. "Check upstairs," a gruff voice ordered. Footsteps headed my way. I darted into the study, ducking behind the heavy oak desk. My breath came in short gasps as I heard someone enter the room. Come out, wherever you are," the voice sing-songed. "We know you're in here, babysitter. Just tell us where the kids are and no one has to get hurt." A chill ran through me. They were here for the children. But why? I stayed perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. The intruder moved around the room, checking behind curtains and closets. Just when I thought he was going to leave, I felt a hand grab my hair, yanking me up. "Found you," he sneered. I screamed, more in anger than fear, and drove my elbow back into his stomach. He grunted, his grip loosening just enough for me to break free. I ran, my only thought to lead them away from the kids. I made it to the kitchen before they cornered me. Two men, both wearing ski masks. One held a gun. "Enough games," the armed one said. "Where are the children?" I straightened up, meeting his gaze defiantly. "I don't know what you're talking about. The kids are at their grandparents' tonight." He laughed, a harsh sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Nice try. We know they're here. Now you're going to tell us where they are, or things are going to get very unpleasant for you." My mind raced. I needed to stall, to buy time. Surely someone must have heard the commotion by now. A neighbor, anyone. "Why do you want them?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "They're just kids." The man with the gun stepped closer. "That's none of your concern. Last chance. Where are they?" I opened my mouth, not sure what I was going to say, when suddenly the room was flooded with red and blue lights. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. The men looked at each other in panic. "Shit, we gotta go." They ran, shoving past me. I heard the back door slam, followed by the sound of a car engine roaring to life. Moments later, the house was swarming with police. As I gave my statement, still shaking from the adrenaline, I learned the truth. The Seabrooks were under witness protection. David had witnessed a high-profile crime, and the men were sent to kidnap the children as leverage. The kids were safe, thank God. The police found them still huddled in their hiding place, scared but unharmed. As I watched Emma and Jake reunite with their frantic parents, I felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly brought me to my knees. In the days that followed, as the story unfolded in the media and the Seabrooks prepared to move to a new safe location, I struggled to process what had happened. The fear, the anger, the overwhelming relief. It was all tangled up inside me. But mostly I felt a fierce pride. I had protected those children. When it mattered most, I had found a strength I never knew I possessed. I don't babysit anymore. The experience left me with nightmares that took months of therapy to address. But it also left me with something else. A deep-seated knowledge that when pushed to the limit, I'm capable of more than I ever imagined. And that's a lesson I'll carry with me always. The click of my camera shutter echoed through the abandoned building, but it wasn't the only sound I heard. As I lowered my camera, the unmistakable noise of hushed voices and shuffling feet reached my ears. In that moment, I realized my urban exploration had led me straight into the middle of something far more dangerous than decaying architecture. I've always been drawn to forgotten places. There's something hauntingly beautiful about abandoned buildings, the way nature slowly reclaims what humans have left behind. As a freelance photographer, I've made a name for myself capturing these decaying urban landscapes, but nothing in my years of urban exploration could have prepared me for what I encountered in the old Blackwood factory. The factory had been on my radar for months. Once the economic heart of our small Midwestern town, it had stood empty for nearly 2 decades, a hulking reminder of better days. Rumors swirled about why it had closed so suddenly. Everything from financial mismanagement to toxic contamination. Whatever the reason, it had become an irresistible target for my lens. I arrived just before dawn, the soft light perfect for the moody shots I had in mind. The factory loomed before me, its broken windows like vacant eyes staring down at the overgrown parking lot. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, but I easily found a gap to slip through. The interior was a photographer's dream. Shafts of early morning sunlight pierced through holes in the roof, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. Rusted machinery stood silent, nature slowly claiming them with creeping vines and moss. I lost myself in my work, moving from room to room, documenting the haunting beauty of decay. I must have been there for hours, completely absorbed in my photography. It wasn't until I entered what must have been the main production floor that I realized something was off. The layer of dust that coated everything else was disturbed here, footprints crisscrossing the floor. And there, in the corner, a pile of empty food wrappers that couldn't have been more than a day old. My heart rate picked up. Had I stumbled upon a homeless encampment? It wasn't uncommon to find people seeking shelter in these abandoned places. I was debating whether to call out a greeting when I heard it, voices coming from somewhere deeper in the building. Curiosity overcame caution. I moved closer, my footsteps silent on the dusty floor. The voices grew clearer as I approached a partially open door. "Shipment comes in tonight. We need to be ready." "Are you sure this place is secure? I thought I heard something earlier. Probably just rats. No one comes here anymore." I froze, my blood running cold. This wasn't a casual conversation. These people, whoever they were up to something illegal, and I was an unwitting witness. I started to back away slowly, praying the old floorboards wouldn't betray me. But in my haste, I knocked against a piece of machinery. The metallic clang seemed to echo forever in the cavernous space. The voices stopped abruptly. "What was that?" "Check it out. Now." Panic surged through me. I looked around frantically for somewhere to hide. There, an old locker, its door hanging open. Without thinking, I dove inside, pulling the door closed behind me. Through the slats, I watched as two men entered the room, guns drawn. "I swear I heard something," one of them said, his eyes scanning the area. "Spread out, check every corner." My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure they'd hear it. I tried to control my breathing, painfully aware of how the slightest sound could give me away. The men moved methodically through the room, checking behind machinery and in dark corners. One of them was getting dangerously close to my hiding spot. I pressed myself further back into the locker, feeling cobwebs brush against my face. Just when I thought discovery was inevitable, a phone rang. The man nearest to me cursed, fishing a cell phone out of his pocket. "Yeah?" he answered gruffly. He listened for a moment, then said, "Understood. We'll be ready." He turned to his partner. "Boss says the shipment's been moved up. We need to prep the loading dock now." The other man nodded, casting one last suspicious look around the room before they both left. I waited several agonizing minutes before daring to emerge from the locker. My legs were shaky, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. I needed to get out of here fast, but as I moved towards the exit, a thought struck me. I had evidence of whatever criminal operation was going on here. My camera was full of photos that could help the police shut this down. Could I really just walk away? The smart thing would be to leave immediately, call the cops from a safe distance. But something made me hesitate. If I could just get a photo of these guys or whatever shipment they were talking about, it could make all the difference. It was a stupid, reckless decision. But I found myself moving deeper into the factory instead of towards safety. I followed the sound of activity to a large loading dock area. Peering around a corner, I saw a group of men busy preparing the space. They were clearing debris, setting up lights, and unloading equipment from a van. Whatever was coming, it was big. With shaking hands, I raised my camera. The telephoto lens would let me capture clear images from this distance. I started snapping photos, trying to get clear shots of faces and the equipment they were setting up. I was so focused on documenting the scene that I didn't notice someone approaching from behind until it was too late. A hand clamped down on my shoulder, spinning me around. I found myself face to face with a burly man, his eyes cold and angry. "Well, well," he growled. "Looks like we've got ourselves a little spy." Before I could react, he'd wrenched the camera from my hands. "Hey," I protested, reaching for it instinctively. He shoved me hard, sending me stumbling backwards. "Boys," he called out, "looks like we've got company." The men from the loading dock rushed over. I was quickly surrounded, a sea of hostile faces glaring at me. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Who sent you?" No one," I stammered. "I'm just a photographer. I was taking pictures of the building. I didn't mean to." "Shut up," Scarface snapped. He turned to the man holding my camera. "What's on it?" The burly man was scrolling through my photos. "Lots of artsy bullshit," he reported, "but also some clear shots of our operation. This guy's been busy." Scarface's expression darkened. "You've seen too much, friend. That's very unfortunate for you." My mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know what's going on here, and I don't want to know. Just let me go. I'll delete the photos. You'll never see me again." Scarface laughed, a chilling sound devoid of humor. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. We can't risk you talking to anyone about what you've seen." One of the other men spoke up. "We should just kill him now. Dump the body in the river." Terror coursed through me. This couldn't be happening. I was going to die here in this abandoned factory, all because of my stupid curiosity. But then, a miracle. In the distance, sirens began to wail. The men looked at each other in panic. "Cops?" one of them asked. "Doesn't matter," Scarface snapped. "We need to move. Now." In the chaos that followed, as the men rushed to pack up their equipment, I saw my chance. I bolted, running faster than I ever had in my life. I heard shouts behind me, maybe even a gunshot, but I didn't stop. I burst out of the factory and kept running, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, collapsing on the sidewalk as police cars sped past, headed towards the factory. Later, after giving my statement to the police and identifying the men from mugshots, I learned the full story. The group had been using the abandoned factory as a distribution center for a major drug trafficking operation. My accidental discovery had led to the biggest drug bust in the county's history. My camera was never recovered, likely destroyed by the criminals before they fled. But the memory card I had instinctively pocketed when I first heard the voices provided enough evidence to ensure convictions. In the weeks that followed, as I dealt with the trauma of what I'd experienced, I found myself questioning everything about my urban exploration hobby. The thrill of discovering forgotten places suddenly seemed hollow compared to the very real dangers I'd faced. But as time passed, I realized that this experience, terrifying as it was, had shown me something important about myself. When faced with a moral choice, to run or to gather evidence that could stop criminals, I had chosen to act, despite the risk. It wasn't smart, and I wouldn't recommend anyone else make the same choice, but it showed me a courage I didn't know I possessed. I still take photos of abandoned places, but now I'm much more careful. And every time I step into a decaying building, I remember that day in the factory. It serves as a constant reminder that sometimes the most dangerous things lurking in forgotten places aren't the crumbling walls or rusty machinery, but the secrets they hide. The first gunshot shattered more than just the peaceful night air. It splintered our sense of security, turning what should have been a fun weekend camping trip into a desperate fight for survival. As I huddled with my friends in the darkness, I realized that the true predators in these woods walked on 2 legs, not 4. It had started as a typical getaway for our group. There were 5 of us: me, my best friend Mike, his girlfriend Sarah, and our college buddies Tom and Lisa. We'd been planning this trip for months, eager to escape the city and spend a few days hiking, fishing, and enjoying nature. We chose a remote campsite in the national forest, about a 4-hour drive from home. It was the kind of place that promised solitude and stunning views, far from the crowded campgrounds closer to civilization. As we set up our tents and gathered wood for the campfire, the air was filled with laughter and the excitement of adventure. The first 2 days were everything we'd hoped for. We hiked trails that wound through dense forests and along crystal-clear streams. We spotted deer, a family of raccoons, and even caught a glimpse of a black bear in the distance. At night, we sat around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories under a sky full of stars. It was on the 3rd night that everything changed. We were sitting around the fire, passing around a bottle of whiskey and trying to outdo each other with increasingly outrageous ghost stories. Mike had just launched into a particularly gruesome tale when we heard it, a branch snapping in the darkness beyond our campsite. "Probably just a deer," Tom said, but there was an edge to his voice that betrayed his unease. We fell silent, straining our ears. For a moment, all we could hear was the crackling of the fire and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then, unmistakably, the sound of footsteps. Heavy footsteps, moving with purpose. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is someone there?" No response. Just more footsteps, closer now. Mike stood up, grabbing a flashlight. "I'm going to check it out," he said. "Are you crazy?" Sarah hissed, grabbing his arm. "What if it's a bear?" "Bears don't walk like that," Mike replied, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. Before we could argue further, a figure emerged from the darkness into the edge of our campfire's light. It was a man, tall and wiry, with a scraggly beard and clothes that had seen better days. But what caught my attention was the rifle he was carrying pointed directly at us. "Well, well," he drawled, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Looks like we've got ourselves some city folk out for a little adventure." As if on cue, 2 more men stepped into the light, both armed. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "Listen," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We don't want any trouble. If this is your land, we're sorry. We'll pack up and leave right now." The first man laughed, a harsh sound that sent chills down my spine. "Oh, you're not going anywhere. You see, we've been watching you folks. All that fancy camping gear, those nice cars you drove in. I bet you've got all sorts of valuable things in those tents of yours." I saw Mike tense, ready to do something foolish. I shot him a warning look, silently pleading with him not to make any sudden moves. "Take whatever you want," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Just please don't hurt us." The man with the beard, clearly the leader, seemed to consider this for a moment. Then he nodded to his companions. "Search the tents. Anything valuable, take it." As the other 2 men started rummaging through our belongings, the leader kept his rifle trained on us. "Now," he said, "empty your pockets, watches, wallets, phones, all of it." With shaking hands, we complied. I felt a surge of anger as I watched them pocket our possessions, but I knew resistance would only make things worse. Once they had gathered everything of value, the leader spoke again. "All right, now here's what's going to happen. You're all going to start walking that way." He gestured towards a dark trail leading deeper into the forest. "Don't try to run. Don't try to be heroes. Just walk." My blood ran cold. They weren't just robbing us. They were going to take us somewhere, and I had a sickening feeling we wouldn't be coming back. As we started down the trail, I frantically tried to think of a way out, but with guns at our backs and unfamiliar terrain all around us, our options were limited. We had been walking for about 10 minutes when it happened. Tom, who had been at the back of our group, suddenly stumbled and fell. In the confusion that followed, Mike saw an opportunity. He lunged at the nearest gunman, tackling him to the ground. "Run!" he shouted. Everything exploded into chaos. Sarah screamed. Lisa took off into the woods. I hesitated for a split second, torn between fleeing and helping Mike. That's when the first shot rang out. The muzzle flash lit up the night, followed by Mike's cry of pain. That decided it for me. I grabbed Sarah's hand and we ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for the branches that whipped at our faces. Behind us I could hear shouting and more gunshots. But we didn't stop. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like lead. Finally, unable to go any further, we collapsed behind a fallen tree. As we lay there, gasping for breath, the reality of our situation began to sink in. We were lost in the woods, in the middle of the night, being hunted by armed men, and we had no idea what had happened to our friends. "We need to find help," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. I nodded, trying to think through the panic clouding my mind. "We passed a ranger station on our way in," I said. "It can't be more than a few miles from here." "But which direction?" Sarah asked, and I could hear the desperation in her voice. I looked up at the sky, searching for the North Star like my dad had taught me years ago. It was a long shot, but it was all we had. "This way," I said, pointing. "I think." We moved as quickly and quietly as we could through the dark forest. Every snapping twig made us freeze. Every distant sound had us ducking for cover. The adrenaline coursing through our veins kept us going, but I knew we couldn't keep this up forever. After what felt like hours, we saw a faint light in the distance. Hope surged through me, giving me a second wind, but as we got closer, my heart sank. It wasn't the ranger station. It was a small cabin nestled in a clearing. "Should we risk it?" Sarah asked. I hesitated. For all we knew, this could be where those men lived, but we were exhausted, lost, and running out of options. "We have to," I said. We approached cautiously. The cabin looked well maintained, with a truck parked outside. I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. For a long moment, there was no response. Then we heard movement inside. The door opened, revealing an older man with a weathered face and kind eyes. He took in our disheveled appearance with a raised eyebrow. "Good Lord," he said. "What happened to you two?" The words came tumbling out of me. The campsite, the armed men, our friends. As I spoke, the man's expression grew increasingly grave. "Come inside," he said when I finished. "I'm John, by the way. I'm a retired park ranger." As we stepped into the warmth of the cabin, I felt the first glimmer of hope since this nightmare began. John immediately went to his radio, calling for help. "I know those woods like the back of my hand," he told us. "And I know about the men you encountered. They've been causing trouble in these parts for years." Over the next few hours, as we waited for help to arrive, John kept us calm with cups of strong coffee and stories of his years as a ranger. When we heard the sound of approaching helicopters, I thought I might cry with relief. The rescue operation was a blur of activity. Park rangers and state police swarmed the area. They found Lisa hiding in a hollow tree, frightened but unharmed. Tom had a nasty bump on his head but was otherwise okay. Mike had been shot in the shoulder, but the wound wasn't life-threatening. He was already being treated in a nearby hospital by the time we were rescued. As for the men who attacked us, they were caught trying to flee the area. It turned out they were wanted for a string of similar attacks on campers across 3 states. In the days and weeks that followed, as we gave statements and attended court hearings, I found myself grappling with the aftermath of our ordeal. The fear lingered, making me jump at unexpected noises and eye strangers with suspicion. But there was something else, too. A newfound appreciation for life, for friendship, for the kindness of strangers like John. We had faced unimaginable danger together and come out the other side. I still go camping. But now, every time I sit around a campfire with friends, I'm acutely aware of how precious those moments are. And I'm grateful, not just for the beauty of nature, but for the strength we found in ourselves and each other when it mattered most. The moment I saw the bruises on little Tommy's arms, I knew something was terribly wrong. What I didn't realize was that my discovery would unravel a web of corruption that ran deeper than I could have ever imagined, turning my quiet night shift at Millbrook General into a dangerous game of cat and mouse. I've been a nurse for over a decade, but nothing in my training prepared me for what I encountered that night. It was a typical Tuesday evening at our small-town hospital. The ER was quiet, just the usual minor injuries and routine check-ins. I was halfway through my shift when the ambulance brought in Tommy Miller, a 7-year-old boy with a broken arm. At first glance, it seemed straightforward enough. Kids break bones all the time, right? But as I helped the doctor examine Tommy, I noticed the telltale signs of abuse. Faded bruises in various stages of healing, a slightly older fracture that had never been treated properly, and the way Tommy flinched at even the gentlest touch. "What happened, Tommy?" I asked softly as I prepared to set up his IV. "I fell off my bike," he mumbled, not meeting my eyes. His father, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard and expensive watch, quickly interjected. "He's always been clumsy. Takes after his mother, God rest her soul." Something about Mr. Miller's tone set me on edge. It was too smooth, too rehearsed. I'd heard similar explanations from abusers before, but there was something else here. Something that didn't quite add up. As I continued to care for Tommy, I noticed more inconsistencies. The location and pattern of his injuries didn't match a bike accident. And then there was the way Mr. Miller kept glancing at his phone, as if waiting for an important message. I decided to trust my instincts. Once Tommy was settled and Mr. Miller stepped out to make a call, I approached Dr. Reyes, the attending physician. "I think we need to report this," I whispered, explaining my suspicions. Dr. Reyes frowned, glancing towards the door where Mr. Miller had exited. "Are you sure, Sarah? That's a serious accusation. And the Millers are, well, they're important people in this town." I was taken aback by his hesitation. Dr. Reyes had always been a strong advocate for his patients, especially children. "Since when does that matter?" I asked. "If a child is being abused? I'll look into it." He cut me off, his tone final. "For now, just finish up Tommy's treatment and discharge him. I'll handle the rest." Something in his eyes made me uneasy. It wasn't just reluctance I saw there, but fear, as if he knew something he wasn't sharing. I returned to Tommy's bedside, my mind racing. As I adjusted his IV, I noticed a small tattoo on his inner wrist, partially hidden by the hospital bracelet. It looked like a series of numbers and letters. "That's a cool tattoo, Tommy," I said casually. "Did you do that yourself?" Tommy's eyes widened in panic. He quickly covered his wrist with his other hand. "It's nothing," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please don't tell my dad you saw it." Before I could respond, Mr. Miller returned. He seemed agitated, checking his watch repeatedly. "How much longer is this going to take?" he demanded. "We're almost done," I assured him, trying to keep my voice neutral. "I just need to go over some aftercare instructions with you." As I explained how to care for Tommy's cast, I couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger than child abuse was going on here. The tattoo, Mr. Miller's behavior, Dr. Reyes' reluctance to report, it all pointed to something sinister. I finished my shift in a daze, my mind churning with possibilities. As I walked to my car in the dimly lit parking lot, a figure stepped out from behind a van. My heart leapt into my throat until I recognized Dr. Reyes. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to talk. Not here. Meet me at Riverside Park in an hour." Before I could respond, he was gone, melting back into the shadows. I sat in my car debating what to do. Every instinct told me to go home, to forget what I'd seen and heard. But the image of Tommy's frightened eyes kept me from turning the key in the ignition. An hour later, I found myself sitting on a bench in the deserted park, jumping at every rustle of leaves. Dr. Reyes arrived, looking haggard and nervous. "I'm sorry about earlier," he began. "I couldn't talk freely at the hospital. The walls have ears." "What's going on?" I demanded. "What aren't you telling me about Tommy?" Dr. Reyes sighed heavily. "It's not just Tommy. There are others. Children disappearing from the system, showing up months later with unexplained injuries and those tattoos." My blood ran cold. "Are you saying—" "Human trafficking," he nodded grimly. "But it goes deeper than that. Local law enforcement, judges, even some hospital staff are involved. They use the hospital to patch up the kids and send them back out." I felt sick. "How long have you known about this?" "I started noticing patterns a few months ago. I've been gathering evidence, trying to find someone I can trust to take it to the feds, but they're watching me. I think they suspect I know something. We have to do something," I insisted. "We can't just let this continue." Dr. Reyes nodded. "That's why I needed to talk to you. I have a contact in the FBI, but I can't risk reaching out directly. I need you to take what I've gathered to him." He handed me a USB drive. "Everything I've found is on here. Names, dates, locations. Be careful, Sarah. These people are dangerous. They won't hesitate to silence anyone who threatens their operation." As I took the drive, the weight of what I was agreeing to hit me. This wasn't just about reporting child abuse anymore. This was stepping into a world of organized crime and corruption. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and paranoia. I felt eyes on me everywhere I went. At work, I noticed certain staff members watching me more closely. Was I imagining things, or had Dr. Reyes' warning made me overly suspicious? I managed to make contact with the FBI agent, arranging to meet him at a cafe in the next town over. But as I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed a familiar car. Mr. Miller's sleek black sedan was parked across the street, and he was watching the cafe entrance. My heart pounding, I drove past without stopping. Somehow they knew. The meeting was compromised. I spent the next hour driving aimlessly, trying to shake off any potential tales. When I was sure I wasn't being followed, I headed to the one place I thought might be safe, my grandmother's old cabin in the woods. As I sat in the dusty living room, the USB drive feeling like it was burning a hole in my pocket, I realized the true gravity of my situation. I couldn't go home. I couldn't go back to work. I was in way over my head with information that could bring down a criminal empire. I thought about Tommy, about all the other children who might be suffering. I couldn't let fear paralyze me. I had to find a way to get this information to the authorities, no matter the risk. Using a prepaid phone I'd bought for emergencies, I called the FBI agent. "The original plan is blown," I said as soon as he answered. "But I have the information. I'll send it to you piece by piece from different locations. They can't watch every post office and internet cafe in the state. Be careful, he warned. Once they realize what you're doing, they'll come after you with everything they've got. I ended the call, my resolve strengthening. I may have been just a small-town nurse, but I was now the key to unraveling a criminal conspiracy that had terrorized countless children. As I prepared to set out on my dangerous mission, I thought again of Tommy's frightened eyes, of the hidden tattoo on his wrist. I thought of all the other children like him, trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. "Hold on," I whispered, though they couldn't hear me. "Help is coming." I knew the road ahead would be fraught with danger. My life as I knew it was over. But as I stepped out into the cool night air, a strange sense of calm settled over me. For the first time in my life, I knew with absolute certainty that I was doing the right thing, no matter the cost. The quiet night shift that had started this journey felt like a lifetime ago. Now I was embarking on a new path, one that would test every ounce of courage and resilience I possessed. But I was ready. For Tommy, for all the children, I would see this through to the end. The day I found Mr. Johnson's dentures in my mailbox was the day I realized that uncovering the truth about my neighbor's disappearance might cost me my life. What started as innocent curiosity in our sleepy town of Millbrook had quickly spiraled into a dangerous game of cat and mouse, with me as the unsuspecting mouse. I'd moved to Millbrook 6 months ago, seeking a quieter life after years in the big city. The town seemed perfect. Picturesque houses lining tree-shaded streets, friendly faces at the local diner, and a sense of community I'd been craving. My next-door neighbor, Mr. Johnson, was a kind, elderly man who always had a smile and a wave for me. That's why his sudden disappearance 3 weeks ago had struck me as odd. One day he was tending to his prized roses, and the next he was gone. No note, no forwarding address, nothing. When I asked around, I got vague answers about him moving to be closer to family. But something didn't sit right. Maybe it was the investigative journalist in me, the part I thought I'd left behind in the city. Or maybe it was the way Mrs. Peterson from across the street averted her eyes when I mentioned Mr. Johnson's name. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong in Millbrook. I started asking questions, casually at first. Just a newcomer curious about town history and gossip. But the more I probed, the more I noticed a pattern. People would clam up, change the subject, or suddenly remember urgent errands when I brought up Mr. Johnson or any of the other handful of residents who had moved away in recent years. It was Officer Daniels who first made me feel like I might be poking a hornet's nest. I'd gone to the police station, ostensibly to report a lost cat. I didn't even own a cat, but really to see if I could glean any information about Mr. Johnson. "Look, Miss Walker," Officer Daniels said, his tone friendly but his eyes hard. "I know you're new here, but Millbrook values its privacy. People come and go. It's best not to pry into others' business." I nodded and smiled, playing the part of the chastised newcomer. But as I left the station, I caught sight of Officer Daniels making a phone call, his expression grim. That night, I found my first warning, if you could call it that. A dead rat on my front porch, its belly slit open. I told myself it was probably just a cat's handiwork, but the knot in my stomach said otherwise. I should have stopped then. Should have heeded the warning and gone back to my quiet life. But I couldn't. The mystery of Mr. Johnson and the others gnawed at me, demanding answers. I started digging deeper, using skills I'd honed as a journalist. I scoured public records looking for patterns in property sales, unusual financial transactions, anything that might shed light on what was happening in Millbrook. That's when I noticed it. A company called Millbrook Enterprises that seemed to be buying up properties all over town, always shortly after the occupants had moved away. The company traced back to a maze of shell corporations, but I was determined to unravel it. I was so engrossed in my investigation that I almost missed the signs that I was being watched. The same car parked across the street day after day, the way conversations would stop when I entered the local coffee shop, the hang-up calls in the middle of the night. But it was the dentures that really drove it home. I'd know Mr. Johnson's distinctive gold-capped tooth anywhere. Finding them in my mailbox, still stained with what looked horribly like blood, sent me into a panic. I ran inside, locking the door behind me, my heart pounding. This was no longer a game. This was a warning, a very clear one. They knew what I was doing, and they wanted me to stop. I spent that night huddled in my living room, jumping at every sound. By morning, I'd made a decision. I couldn't stop now, not when I was so close to uncovering the truth. But I needed help. I reached out to an old colleague from my reporting days, someone I trusted implicitly. I encrypted everything I'd found and sent it to her, with instructions to publish it all if she didn't hear from me in 48 hours. Then, I did the last thing anyone in Millbrook would expect. I went to the annual town festival as if nothing was wrong. I smiled, I chatted, I ate overpriced cotton candy. All the while I was watching, waiting for someone to make a move. It was Mayor Griffith who finally approached me, his politician's smile firmly in place. "Sarah, my dear," he said, placing a hand on my arm that felt more like a vice grip. "Why don't you join me for a chat in my office? There are some concerns we'd like to address." I knew this was it, the moment of truth. I followed him to town hall, my phone in my pocket, secretly recording everything. The mayor's office was packed. Officer Daniels was there, along with several prominent business owners I recognized. The air was thick with tension. "Sarah," Mayor Griffith began, his tone no longer friendly, "I'm afraid you've been making quite a nuisance of yourself lately, asking questions that don't concern you, digging into matters best left alone." "Where's Mr. Johnson?" I asked, deciding to cut right to the chase. The mayor's eye twitched. "Mr. Johnson decided to leave town, as have several others who found Millbrook unconducive to their lifestyles." "And Millbrook Enterprises? The company that seems to acquire property every time someone conveniently decides to leave town." A flicker of surprise crossed the mayor's face, quickly replaced by anger. "You really don't know when to stop, do you? Do you have any idea what you're meddling with? Why don't you tell me?" I challenged, my heart racing but my voice steady. What followed was a confession that chilled me to the bone. Millbrook, it turned out, wasn't just a quaint small town. It was the center of a vast money laundering operation, funneling millions in drug money through real estate deals and local businesses. Those who discovered the truth or refused to play along, like Mr. Johnson, were given a choice: leave town and keep quiet, or face the consequences. "So you see, Sarah," the mayor concluded, "you have a decision to make. You can leave Millbrook tonight, forget everything you've learned, or..." The threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. I took a deep breath, weighing my options. Then I smiled, reaching into my pocket. Everyone tensed, probably expecting a weapon. Instead, I pulled out my phone. "I've got a third option," I said, my voice surprisingly calm. "This entire conversation has been recorded and uploaded to a secure server. If anything happens to me, it goes public, along with all the evidence I've gathered over the past weeks." The room erupted into chaos. Accusations flew, voices raised in anger and panic. In the commotion, I slipped out, my legs shaky but my resolve firm. I'd love to say that was the end of it, that the bad guys were arrested, justice was served, and Millbrook returned to being the idyllic town it had pretended to be. But real life is rarely so neat. The truth did come out eventually. My recording, combined with the evidence I'd gathered, was enough to launch a federal investigation. But small towns have long memories, and not everyone believed the truth, even when faced with undeniable evidence. I couldn't stay in Millbrook, of course. There were too many people who blamed me for destroying their way of life, for exposing secrets long buried. I moved away, back to the city I thought I'd left behind for good. But I carry Millbrook with me in more ways than one. The lessons I learned there, about corruption, about the masks people wear, about the courage it takes to stand up for the truth, those will stay with me forever. Sometimes late at night, I still think about Mr. Johnson and the others who disappeared. I hope that someday they'll get justice. And I hope that my actions, as tumultuous as their consequences were, played some small part in making that possible. The quiet life I sought in Millbrook turned out to be anything but. Yet, in unraveling its dark secrets, I found a part of myself I thought I'd lost. The part that refuses to look away from injustice, no matter the personal cost. And in the end, isn't that worth more than any false peace could ever be? The moment I saw the wild, desperate eyes of the man I'd just pulled from the churning sea, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. My act of kindness in rescuing a shipwrecked sailor had invited a nightmare into my sanctuary, and as the storm raged outside, I realized the true danger was now locked inside the lighthouse with me. I'd been the keeper of the Crescent Point Lighthouse for nearly a decade, and I'd grown to love the solitude and purpose it provided. Perched on a rocky outcropping off the coast of Maine, the lighthouse was my home, my responsibility, and my refuge from a world that had often felt too chaotic and cruel. That fateful night started like many others. A nasty nor'easter had blown in, whipping the sea into a frenzy of white-capped waves and driving rain. I'd secured everything outside, checked the generator, and settled in for a long night of ensuring the light kept burning, a beacon of hope and warning for any ships caught in the tempest. It was nearing midnight when I saw it, a flare, bright red against the inky sky, not more than a half-mile out. My heart raced as I grabbed my binoculars and peered into the darkness. There, illuminated briefly by a flash of lightning, I saw a small boat being tossed mercilessly by the waves, and clinging to it a solitary figure. I didn't hesitate. I'd trained for this, knew the risks and the protocol. I called the Coast Guard immediately, but I knew they'd take at least an hour to reach us in this weather. By then, it might be too late. Donning my foul-weather gear, I rushed to the boathouse and launched the rescue dinghy. The moment I cleared the sheltered cove, the full force of the storm hit me. Waves crashed over the bow, the wind howled in my ears, and icy rain stung my face. But I pushed on, guided by my lighthouse's steady beam and the intermittent flares from the stranded boat. As I drew closer, I could make out the man more clearly. He was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 30s, with wild, dark hair plastered to his face by the rain. His eyes were wide with fear and desperation. "Hold on," I shouted over the roar of the storm. "I'm going to throw you a line." It took 3 attempts before he managed to grab the rope. With strength born of desperation, he pulled himself to my boat and I helped haul him aboard. He collapsed in the bottom of the dinghy, coughing and gasping. "Thank you," he managed between ragged breaths. "I thought I was done for." The journey back to the lighthouse was arduous, but the sense of relief at having saved a life buoyed me. Once we were safely inside, I helped the man to the kitchen, wrapping him in blankets and pressing a mug of hot coffee into his trembling hands. "I'm Jack," I said, finally introducing myself. "What's your name? What happened out there?" He looked up at me, and for a moment I saw something flash in his eyes, something that made my blood run cold. But it was gone so quickly I convinced myself I'd imagined it. "Tom," he said. "My name's Tom, and you wouldn't believe me if I told you." I should have pressed him further. Should have noticed the way his eyes darted around the room, assessing exits, looking for anything that could be used as a weapon. But I was tired from the rescue, and my guard was down in the safety of my lighthouse. "Well, Tom," I said, "the Coast Guard is on their way. They'll be here in about an hour to pick you up and get you to a hospital to be checked out." That's when everything changed. Tom's demeanor shifted instantly, the gratitude in his eyes replaced by a cold, hard look. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Jack," he said, his voice suddenly steady and menacing. "You see, I can't have the Coast Guard finding me, or anyone else for that matter." Before I could react, he was on his feet, the blanket falling away to reveal a gun tucked into his waistband. He pulled it out, pointing it directly at me. "Now here's what's going to happen," Tom said, all pretense of the grateful survivor gone. "You're going to call off the Coast Guard, tell them it was a false alarm. Then you're going to help me figure out how to get off this God-forsaken rock without being detected." My mind raced, trying to understand how I'd gone from rescuer to hostage in the span of minutes. "Who are you?" I asked, my mouth dry with fear. "What do you want?" Tom laughed, a harsh sound that sent chills down my spine. "Who I am doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm a man with nothing to lose and everything to gain by disappearing. And you, my friend, are going to help me do just that." The next few hours were a blur of tension and fear. I made the call to the Coast Guard, hating myself for every lie that came out of my mouth. Tom ransacked the lighthouse, looking for anything that could aid his escape. All the while, I racked my brain for a way out of this nightmare. As dawn approached, Tom grew increasingly agitated. "There has to be a way off this damn island," he shouted, pacing the small living quarters like a caged animal. "There isn't," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Not until the supply boat comes next week, or unless you want to try swimming to the mainland." He whirled on me, eyes blazing. "You're lying. There has to be another way. A radio, a hidden boat, something." I shook my head. "This is a lighthouse, not a marina. The rescue boat you came in on is the only one, and it's not designed for long trips. Tom's face contorted with rage. He raised the gun, pressing it against my forehead. Then maybe I don't need you anymore. Maybe I should just take my chances on my own. I closed my eyes, certain this was the end. But then, a sound cut through the tension, the deep, resonant horn of a ship. We both rushed to the window. Through the lingering mist of the storm, we could make out the outline of a large cargo vessel passing dangerously close to the rocks. "That's it," Tom said, a manic grin spreading across his face. "That's my ticket out of here. You're going to signal that ship, tell them you have an injured man who needs immediate evacuation." "I can't do that," I protested. "It's too dangerous for them to attempt a rescue in these conditions. They could run aground." Tom's response was to cock the gun. "You'll do it, or I'll kill you and signal them myself. Your choice?" With a heavy heart, I moved to the radio. But as I reached for the transmitter, an idea struck me. A desperate, dangerous idea, but one that might be my only chance. I began to send the signal, but not the one Tom had demanded. Instead, I used an old emergency code, one that any experienced sailor would recognize as a warning of imminent danger. "What are you telling them?" Tom demanded, his voice rising in panic. "Exactly what you asked," I lied, praying he wouldn't see through my deception. The ship's horn blared again, this time in a specific pattern. They had received my message and understood. They were alerting the authorities. Tom must have sensed something was wrong. He lunged for the radio, but I was ready. I ducked under his grasp and ran for the stairs, taking them two at a time as I raced for the top of the lighthouse. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. I burst out onto the gallery that encircled the great lens, the wind nearly knocking me off my feet. Tom emerged seconds later, his gun trained on me, his face a mask of fury. "It's over," he snarled. "You're out of options." But he was wrong. As we stood there, the wind whipping around us, I saw another light on the horizon. The Coast Guard had arrived. In that moment of distraction, I made my move. I lunged at Tom, grappling for the gun. We struggled, teetering dangerously close to the railing. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the confined space. I felt a searing pain in my shoulder, but adrenaline kept me fighting. With one final surge of strength, I managed to wrench the gun from Tom's grasp. It went flying over the railing, disappearing into the churning sea below. Backup arrived minutes later, Coast Guard officers swarming the lighthouse. Tom was taken into custody, and I was rushed to the mainland for medical treatment. In the days that followed, I learned the full story. Tom was a fugitive, wanted for a string of violent robberies across 3 states. He had stolen the boat in a desperate attempt to flee the country. As I recovered in the hospital, my thoughts kept returning to that night, to the moment I'd seen that flare and made the decision to launch a rescue. I'd acted out of compassion, out of a deep-seated belief in the value of every human life. Did I regret it? In my darkest moments, when the pain in my shoulder flared or the nightmares jolted me awake, I wondered. But then I'd remember why I became a lighthouse keeper in the first place, to be a beacon of hope, a guide through treacherous waters. I returned to my lighthouse as soon as I was able. The first night back, as I watched the beam cut through the darkness, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, there was danger in the world. Yes, trust could be betrayed. But I couldn't let that change who I was or what I believed in. The lighthouse stood strong as it had for generations, and I would stand with it, ready to light the way for those in need, no matter the storm. The moment I saw the tattoo on his wrist, I knew I'd picked up more than just another lonely hitchhiker. There, etched in faded blue ink, was the unmistakable mark of the Southside Serpents, a notorious gang I'd thought I'd left behind in my rearview mirror years ago. But now, here I was, 70 miles an hour down a dark highway, with a potential killer riding shotgun in my rig. I've been driving trucks for nearly 2 decades, and I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road. Long nights, endless stretches of highway, and the occasional oddball passenger tend to blur together after a while. But this night was different from the start. It was a Thursday, just past midnight. I was hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to Kansas City, fighting to keep my eyes open as the white lines of I-55 stretched endlessly before me. That's when I saw him, a lone figure on the side of the road, thumb out, looking more desperate than dangerous. Now, I'm not usually one for picking up hitchhikers. Too many horror stories, too many risks in this line of work. But something about this guy made me pause. Maybe it was the defeated slump of his shoulders or the way he seemed to shiver in the cool night air. Whatever it was, I found myself easing off the gas and pulling onto the shoulder. As my rig ground to a halt, I got my first good look at him. He was younger than I expected, probably in his late 20s, with a scruffy beard and clothes that had seen better days. A worn backpack hung from one shoulder. "Where you headed?" I called out, rolling down the passenger window. "Just as far west as you're going," he replied, flashing a grateful smile. "Thanks for stopping, man. It's been a long night." I nodded, gesturing for him to hop in. As he climbed into the cab, I caught a whiff of cigarette smoke and something else I couldn't quite place. "Name's Mike," I said, extending a hand. "What brings you out to the middle of nowhere at this hour?" He shook my hand, his grip firmer than I expected. "Jake. And, just trying to get a fresh start, leaving some things behind." I pulled back onto the highway, the familiar rumble of the engine filling the silence. Jake seemed content to stare out the window, and I didn't push for conversation. The miles ticked by, the darkness outside broken only by the occasional passing car. It was when Jake reached up to adjust the air vent that I saw it. His sleeve rode up just enough to reveal the tattoo, a coiled serpent, its forked tongue flicking out menacingly. My blood ran cold. I knew that symbol all too well. Years ago, in another life, I'd had run-ins with the Southside Serpents. They were bad news. Drug running, extortion, murder. You name it, they had a hand in it. And now I had one of them sitting next to me in my truck. I tried to keep my voice casual. "That's some ink you've got there. Means something special?" Jake's hand immediately went to his wrist, pulling his sleeve down. His easy demeanor vanished, replaced by a wary, almost predatory look. "It's nothing. Just a mistake from a long time ago." But I knew better. You don't get that tattoo by mistake, and you don't just walk away from the serpents. Whatever Jake was running from, it was serious. The cab suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, hyper-aware of every movement Jake made. My mind raced, trying to figure out how to handle this situation. Should I confront him? Try to drop him off at the next town? Or just keep driving and pray he really was looking for a fresh start? Jake must have sensed my unease. He shifted in his seat, his hand drifting towards his jacket pocket. "Something wrong, Mike? You're looking a little tense there." I forced a smile, keeping my eyes on the road. "Nah, just tired. Long haul, you know how it is." He nodded, but I could feel his eyes on me. The tension in the cab was palpable now, like a rubber band stretched to its breaking point. We drove on in silence for what felt like hours, though my watch told me it was only minutes. I was just starting to think maybe I'd overreacted when Jake spoke up. "Mike, I couldn't help but notice how you reacted to my tattoo," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Seems like maybe you know more about it than you're letting on." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble. Whatever you're involved in, it's none of my business. I'm just trying to get my load to Kansas City." Jake laughed, a harsh sound that sent chills down my spine. "Oh, but it is your business now, Mike. See, I'm not just leaving things behind, I'm running. And now, you're my ticket to freedom." In one fluid motion, he pulled a gun from his jacket pocket, pointing it directly at me. "Keep driving," he ordered, "and don't try anything stupid." My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. This was every trucker's nightmare come to life. Trapped in my own rig, a gun pointed at my head, miles from any help. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just keep driving west," Jake said. "I'll let you know when to stop." As the miles ticked by, my mind raced, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. I thought about my wife at home, about my kids. Would I ever see them again? The weight of the wedding ring on my finger felt suddenly heavy, a reminder of everything I stood to lose. We passed a sign for a rest stop coming up in 5 miles. An idea began to form in my mind. It was risky, maybe even suicidal, but it was the only chance I had. "Listen, Jake," I said, keeping my voice as calm as possible. "I need to stop at this rest area coming up. Truck's running low on fuel, and I need to log my hours. It's the law." Jake's eyes narrowed. "No stops. We keep driving." "Look," I insisted, If we don't stop, we'll run out of gas in the middle of nowhere. And if I don't log my hours, we'll have highway patrol on our tail. Is that what you want?" He considered this for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but make it quick, and don't try anything funny." As we pulled into the rest stop, I saw my chance. The place was fairly busy, even at this late hour. Truckers, families on late-night road trips, all potential witnesses or help. I eased the rig into a parking spot, my heart racing. "I need to get out to fuel up," I said. "You want to keep that gun trained on me in front of all these people?" Jake hesitated, looking around at the other travelers. I could see the conflict in his eyes. Finally, he lowered the gun, but his voice was steel. "Go fuel up. I'll be watching. Try to signal anyone, and I start shooting." I nodded, stepping out of the cab on shaky legs. As I began to fuel up, my mind worked overtime. I needed to alert someone, but how? Jake's eyes were on me constantly. That's when I saw her, a highway patrol officer walking back to her cruiser with a coffee in hand. My heart leapt. This was my chance. As I finished fueling, I deliberately fumbled with my wallet, dropping it near the officer's car. "Excuse me, officer," I called out, moving towards her. I seemed to have dropped my wallet. I could feel Jake's eyes burning into my back as I approached the officer. As I bent to retrieve my wallet, I whispered urgently, "I have an armed man in my truck. He's forcing me to drive him west. Please help." The officer's eyes widened, but to her credit, she didn't react outwardly. She nodded almost imperceptibly, then said in a normal voice, "Here you go, sir. Drive safely now." I walked back to the truck, my heart in my throat. Jake's face was a mask of suspicion. "What was that about?" he demanded as I climbed back in. "Nothing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just dropped my wallet. Didn't want to leave without it." Jake's eyes bored into me, searching for any sign of deception. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "All right then, let's get moving." As we pulled out of the rest stop, I saw the highway patrol car pull out behind us, keeping a discreet distance. A mix of relief and terror washed over me. Help was coming, but what would Jake do when he realized he was trapped? The next few minutes were the longest of my life. I tried to drive normally, all too aware of the gun still pointed at me and the patrol car following behind. Jake was growing increasingly agitated, constantly checking the mirrors. "Hey," he suddenly shouted. "That cop has been behind us since the rest stop. What did you do?" Before I could respond, the patrol car's lights flashed on, its siren wailing. Jake's face contorted with rage. "You son of a—" I didn't let him finish. In that moment of distraction, I slammed on the brakes and swerved hard to the right. Jake, caught off guard, lost his grip on the gun. It clattered to the floor as the truck screeched to a halt on the shoulder. What followed was a blur of shouted commands, flashing lights, and the cold bite of asphalt as I was ordered out of the truck with my hands up. I complied, relief washing over me as I saw Jake being pulled from the passenger side, hands cuffed behind his back. In the days that followed, as I gave statements and testified in court, I learned the full story. Jake was wanted for a double homicide, on the run from both the law and his former gang. My truck had been his last desperate attempt at escape. The experience left me shaken. For weeks afterward, I jumped at every sound, eyed every stranger with suspicion. But slowly I found my way back behind the wheel. The open road called to me, as it always had. Now, when I pass a hitchhiker on the side of the road, I don't stop. But I do say a little prayer for them, and for myself. Because I know firsthand how quickly a simple act of kindness can turn into a fight for survival. And out here on the highway, with nothing but darkness and white lines stretching endlessly before you, sometimes all you have is your wits, your courage, and the hope that you'll make it home safely one more time. The moment his hand brushed against mine as he shifted gears, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. What had started as an act of kindness, picking up a stranded motorist on a lonely stretch of highway, had morphed into a nightmare trapped inside my own car. As the miles ticked by, I realized that my Good Samaritan act might cost me my life. It was supposed to be a simple 4-hour drive from my small hometown to the city where I'd landed my first real job after college. I'd made the trip dozens of times before, usually uneventful save for the occasional deer sighting or slow-moving tractor. But this time was different from the moment I saw the stalled car on the side of the road. It was getting dark, that dusky twilight when everything takes on a bluish hue. The car was an old model, maybe from the 90s, its hazard lights blinking weakly. A man was bent over the open hood, his frustration evident even from a distance. I should have kept driving. That's what my mom always told me. Never stop for strangers, Sarah. You call for help from a safe distance. But something made me slow down. Maybe it was the desolate stretch of road, no other cars in sight. Or maybe it was the memory of my own breakdown a year ago, and the kind older couple who had stopped to help. Whatever the reason, I found myself pulling over, gravel crunching under my tires as I came to a stop a few yards behind the stalled vehicle. "Everything okay?" I called out, rolling down my window but keeping the engine running and the doors locked. The man straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. He looked to be in his mid-30s, with the kind of rugged handsomeness you'd see in a cowboy movie. "Battery's dead," he said, flashing a grateful smile. "You wouldn't happen to have jumper cables, would you?" I shook my head. "Sorry, no, but I can give you a ride to the next town if you'd like. There's a mechanic there who might be able to help." He hesitated for a moment, glancing back at his car. "That's real kind of you, miss. If it's not too much trouble, I'd appreciate that." Against my better judgment, I unlocked the doors. "Hop in." As he settled into the passenger seat, I caught a whiff of cigarette smoke and something else, something vaguely chemical that I couldn't place. "I'm Sarah," I said, extending my hand. He shook it, his grip firm. "Tom, thanks again for stopping. Not many people would do that these days." I pulled back onto the highway, the darkness deepening around us. For a while we drove in silence, the radio playing softly in the background. I snuck glances at Tom when I thought he wasn't looking, taking in his profile, the way his fingers tapped restlessly on his knee. "So what brings you out this way?" I asked, trying to break the tension. Tom shrugged. "Just passing through. Had some business in the area." "Oh? What kind of business?" He turned to look at me, and something in his eyes made me wish I hadn't asked. "The kind that's best not talked about," he said, his voice low. A chill ran down my spine. I focused on the road ahead, my knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. The next town was still 20 miles away. 20 long, lonely miles. "Mind if I smoke?" Tom asked, already pulling out a pack of cigarettes. "Actually, I'd rather you didn't," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Asthma." He grunted, shoving the pack back into his pocket. As he did, his jacket rode up slightly, and I caught a glimpse of something tucked into his waistband. My breath caught in my throat. Was that a gun? Tom must have noticed my reaction. "Problem?" he asked, his tone casual but with an undercurrent of menace. No," I stammered. "Just realized I might have taken a wrong turn." He laughed, a harsh sound that made me flinch. "Oh, I don't think so, Sarah. I think you're exactly where you're supposed to be." My mind raced. What did he mean by that? Had he planned this somehow? I thought back to his stalled car, wondering if it had really broken down or if it had all been a setup. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "I don't want any trouble. Why don't I just drop you off here and—" "Keep driving," Tom interrupted, all pretense of friendliness gone. "In fact, take the next right. We're going on a little detour." I saw the turnoff he was referring to, a dirt road leading off into dense woods. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "Please," I said, hating the tremor in my voice. "I have family waiting for me. They'll know something's wrong if I don't show up." Tom's hand moved to his waistband, confirming my worst fears. "I won't ask again. Turn. Now." With shaking hands, I steered the car onto the dirt road. Branches scraped against the sides of the car as we bumped along the uneven surface. The headlights illuminated only a small patch of road ahead, the darkness of the forest pressing in on all sides. "Stop here," Tom ordered after we'd driven for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. I brought the car to a halt, my mind whirling with possible escape scenarios. Could I make a run for it? But where would I go in these woods? And even if I could outrun him, he had a gun. "Give me your phone," Tom demanded. I handed it over, watching helplessly as he rolled down the window and tossed it into the undergrowth. "Now here's what's going to happen," he said, turning to face me fully. You're going to drive me wherever I tell you to go. You try to signal for help, you try to escape, you do anything I don't like, and things will get very unpleasant. Understand? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Good. Now let's get back to the main road. We've got a long drive ahead of us. As we merged back onto the highway, my mind raced. How had a simple act of kindness turned into this nightmare? I thought about my family, probably starting to worry by now. Would I ever see them again? The hours crawled by, each mile feeling like an eternity. Tom directed me onto smaller roads, then back to highways, a seemingly random pattern designed to confuse me and avoid major towns. He allowed only brief stops for gas, always keeping me in sight. As dawn began to break, painting the sky in pale pinks and golds, I felt a flicker of hope. Surely someone would notice something was wrong soon. A gas station attendant maybe, or a patrol car. But Tom was careful. He kept his gun hidden but always within reach, a constant, unspoken threat. At gas stations he stood close, his hand on my back in a gesture that might have looked affectionate to an outsider but was really a warning. It was at one of these stops, as I was pumping gas with trembling hands, that I saw my chance. A police cruiser pulled into the station, the officer stepping out to grab a coffee. Time seemed to slow down. I knew I had only seconds to act. Tom had stepped away to use the restroom, confident in his threats to keep me in line. With my heart in my throat, I approached the officer. "Excuse me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need help. The man I'm with..." But before I could finish, I felt a hand clamp down on my shoulder. "There you are, honey." Tom's voice came from behind me, sickly sweet. "I was worried you'd gotten lost." The officer looked between us, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. "Everything okay here?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Tom's grip on my shoulder tightened painfully. "Just fine, officer," Tom said smoothly. "My wife gets a little confused sometimes. Early onset dementia, you know how it is." The officer's suspicion faded, replaced by sympathy. "I'm sorry to hear that. You folks have a safe trip now." As the officer walked away, I felt the last of my hope drain away. Tom steered me back to the car, his fingers digging into my arm. "That was very stupid, Sarah," he growled as we pulled back onto the road. "I warned you what would happen if you tried anything." Tears burned in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me cry. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, I tried to take stock of my situation. We'd been driving for nearly 12 hours now. My family would definitely know something was wrong. They'd have called the police by now. But how would anyone find me? That's when I saw it. A sign for an upcoming rest area. An idea began to form in my mind. It was risky, maybe even suicidal, but it was the only chance I had. "I need to use the restroom," I said, my voice hoarse from hours of disuse. Tom glanced at me suspiciously. "You can hold it." "No, I can't," I insisted, injecting a note of panic into my voice. "I'm going to be sick." He studied me for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. "Fine. But remember, I'll be right outside. Don't try anything stupid." I pulled into the rest area, my heart racing. As soon as I was in the bathroom stall, I pulled out the pen I'd palmed from the last gas station. On a scrap of toilet paper, I hastily scrawled, "Help. Kidnapped. Blue sedan license plate JKL 4567. I flushed the toilet and exited the stall, the note clutched in my sweaty palm. As I washed my hands, I saw my chance, a young woman about my age checking her makeup in the mirror. "Excuse me," I said, making eye contact with her in the mirror. "Could you hand me a paper towel?" As she turned to the dispenser, I pressed the note into her hand, giving her a desperate look. Her eyes widened in understanding, and she gave an almost imperceptible nod. Heart pounding, I exited the bathroom. Tom was waiting, his eyes scanning the parking lot suspiciously. "Let's go," he said gruffly, ushering me back to the car. As we pulled out of the rest area, I allowed myself a tiny flicker of hope. Would the woman understand the urgency of the note? Would she call for help in time? The next hour was the longest of my life. Every police car we passed made my heart race. Was this the one? Had my message gotten through? And then, finally, I saw them. A roadblock up ahead, a line of police cars with lights flashing. Tom saw it too. He cursed, his hand moving to his waistband. "Drive through it," he ordered, his voice tight with panic. But I'd been waiting for this moment. Instead of accelerating, I slammed on the brakes and cranked the steering wheel hard to the right. The car spun, tires screeching. Tom was thrown against the door, the gun flying from his hand. Before he could recover, I was out of the car, running towards the police with my hands in the air. "Help me," I screamed. "He's got a gun." What followed was a blur of shouted commands, hands pulling me to safety, the sound of a scuffle as Tom was subdued and arrested. Hours later, as I sat wrapped in a blanket in a police station, the full weight of what I'd been through hit me. I broke down, sobs racking my body as a kind-faced detective patted my shoulder. "You're safe now," she assured me. "And thanks to your quick thinking, we were able to catch a man wanted in 3 states for kidnapping and worse." In the days and weeks that followed, as I gave statements and testified in court, I grappled with the impact of those harrowing hours. I had nightmares, jumped at every unexpected sound, eyed every stranger with suspicion. But slowly, with the help of therapy and the unwavering support of my family, I began to heal. I learned that my ordeal had led to the rescue of 2 other women Tom had kidnapped, and the closure of several cold cases. I still drive that stretch of highway sometimes, usually with a friend or family member by my side. And every time I pass the spot where I first saw Tom's car, I say a little prayer of thanks. Thanks for my survival, for the kindness of strangers like the woman in the rest stop, and for the strength I found within myself when it mattered most. I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore, but I haven't lost my belief in the goodness of people. I've just learned to balance it with caution, to trust my instincts, and to always have an escape plan. Because sometimes the real monster isn't hiding under your bed or in your closet. Sometimes it's sitting right next to you, asking for a ride. The moment I saw the glint of metal in his hand, I knew this wasn't just another routine patrol. What had started as a quiet night shift in Oakwood Estates had suddenly become a desperate race to prevent a crime I didn't yet understand. Little did I know, my decision to investigate that shadowy figure would unravel a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of our quaint suburban community. I'd been working security at Oakwood Estates for about 6 months. It was a cushy gig, mostly involving driving around in a golf cart, checking gates, and occasionally asking teenagers to keep the noise down. The residents were wealthy and private, the kind of people who valued their peace and quiet above all else. That night started like any other. I clocked in at 10 p.m., did my usual perimeter check, and settled in for what I expected to be another uneventful shift. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke from distant fireplaces. It was around 2 a.m. when I first noticed something off. I was doing my rounds in the golf cart when movement caught my eye, a figure darting between the shadows of 2 large oak trees. At first I thought it might be a deer. We got them sometimes, wandering in from the nearby forest. But the movement was too deliberate, too human. I slowed the cart, squinting into the darkness. There it was again, definitely a person, trying very hard not to be seen. My heart rate picked up. This was unusual. Oakwood residents didn't typically skulk around their own neighborhood in the middle of the night. I debated calling it in, but what would I say? That I saw a shadow? I needed more information. So against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. Leaving the cart, I moved quietly towards where I'd last seen the figure. The manicured lawns muffled my footsteps, but I still winced at every twig that snapped under my feet. As I drew closer to the house, the figure seemed to be circling. I recognized it as belonging to the Andersons. Tom Anderson was some big-shot lawyer or banker. I could never keep track of what all these rich folks did. That's when I saw it, the metallic glint that made my blood run cold. The figure was crouched by a ground-floor window, and in his hand was unmistakably a crowbar. This wasn't just trespassing. This was a burglary in progress. I reached for my radio, ready to call for backup, when a sound made me freeze. It was the creak of a door opening, followed by hushed voices. More than one person was involved. "Hurry up," a low voice hissed. "We need to be in and out before anyone notices." "I'm working as fast as I can," another voice replied, tension evident in every word. "You try picking a state-of-the-art lock with sweaty hands." I pressed myself against the side of the house, heart pounding. This was way above my pay grade. I should call the police, let them handle it. But something held me back. A nagging feeling that there was more going on here than a simple break-in. The sound of shattering glass made me jump. They'd given up on finesse and gone for brute force. I peered around the corner, just in time to see two figures slipping through the now broken window. I had to do something. The Andersons could be in danger, but I was unarmed, untrained for this kind of situation. My hand hovered over my radio, ready to make the call that would bring squad cars screaming into the quiet neighborhood. That's when I heard it. A child's frightened cry from inside the house. All hesitation vanished. I couldn't wait for the police. I had to act now. Adrenaline coursing through my veins, I moved toward the broken window. Glass crunched under my feet as I carefully climbed through, wincing as a sharp edge caught my arm. The interior of the house was dark, but I could hear movement and muffled voices from upstairs. I moved as quietly as I could, years of late-night snack runs finally paying off as I navigated the unfamiliar space. As I reached the top of the stairs, the voices became clearer. They were coming from a room at the end of the hall, a child's bedroom, judging by the decorations I could make out in the dim light. "Please," a woman's voice pleaded, thick with tears. "Don't do this. She's just a child." "Shut up," a harsh male voice responded. "You knew this could happen when your husband decided to grow a conscience." I edged closer to the partially open door, my heart in my throat. Through the crack, I could see Mrs. Anderson on her knees, arms wrapped protectively around a small pajama-clad figure. Two men stood over them, faces hidden by ski masks. "Where are the files?" one of the men demanded. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mrs. Anderson insisted. The man raised his hand and I saw the glint of a gun. Wrong answer. I didn't think, I just acted. Bursting through the door, I tackled the armed man with all my might. We went down in a tangle of limbs, the gun skittering across the floor. What followed was chaos. Mrs. Anderson screamed. The child wailed. The second intruder lunged for the gun, but Mrs. Anderson was faster. She grabbed it, pointing it with shaking hands at the masked men. "Don't move," she said, her voice steadier than I would have expected. I managed to pin down the man I tackled, using zip ties from my utility belt to secure his hands. The other man raised his hands in surrender, clearly not willing to risk getting shot. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes before the wail of sirens filled the air. Someone must have heard the commotion and called the police. As squad cars flooded the street and officers swarmed the house, I found myself sitting on the front steps, giving my statement to a detective. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me shaky and exhausted. "You took a hell of a risk," the detective said, shaking his head. "But you probably saved their lives. Good work, kid." But as the night wore on and more details emerged, I realized this was far from over. The break-in wasn't a simple burglary. It was connected to something much bigger. Tom Anderson, it turned out, was a prosecutor who had been building a case against a ring of corrupt local officials. The men who broke in were sent to retrieve evidence he'd gathered, evidence that implicated some very powerful people in bribery, embezzlement, and worse. In the days that followed, as I gave more statements and watched the story unfold on local news, I grappled with the implications of what had happened. The quiet, affluent community I'd been patrolling wasn't as perfect as it seemed. Beneath the manicured lawns and pristine facades lurked secrets and corruption. My role in foiling the break-in had made me something of a local hero. Residents who had previously barely acknowledged my existence now stopped to shake my hand or offer thanks. But it also made me a target. Anonymous threats started appearing, notes left on my windshield, suspicious cars following me home. The police offered protection, but I knew they couldn't watch me 24/7. I considered quitting, moving away, starting fresh somewhere new. But something kept me in Oakwood Estates. Maybe it was a sense of duty, or maybe just plain stubbornness. I'd stumbled into this mess, and now I felt responsible for seeing it through. So I stayed. I kept working my night shifts, but now with a heightened awareness of the secrets that might be hiding behind every perfectly painted front door. I started paying more attention to the gossip, the whispered conversations that stopped when I approached. Slowly, I began to piece together a bigger picture. The corruption went beyond just a few officials. It was systemic, deeply ingrained in the very fabric of the community. And I realized that my accidental heroics that night had placed me in a unique position to do something about it. I started gathering my own evidence, carefully documenting suspicious activities and conversations. It was dangerous work, and there were nights when every shadow made me jump. Every unexpected sound had me reaching for a weapon I didn't carry. But I persevered. because that night had shown me something important. That one person, even someone as seemingly insignificant as a night security guard, could make a difference, could save lives, could uncover truths that others wanted to keep hidden. As I write this, the investigation is still ongoing. Tom Anderson's case has blown wide open, leading to arrests and resignations at the highest levels of local government. And me? I'm still here, still patrolling the quiet streets of Oakwood Estates. But now, when I look at these grand houses with their perfectly manicured lawns, I see them differently. I know that behind every pristine facade, there might be secrets lurking. And I'm ready to shine a light on those shadows no matter the cost, because that's what I've become. Not just a security guard, but a guardian of truth in a place where lies have lived too comfortably for far too long. It's a dangerous job, but somebody's got to do it. And for better or worse, that somebody is me.